Hello and welcome to Introduction to ZBrush 2020. I'm Madeline Spencer and I will be your instructor in this, the most comprehensive video training series available for Pixelogic ZBrush. We'll start as though you've never touched ZBrush before with a quick start tutorial. In the quick start, you will sculpt a creature bust from a polysphere. You'll learn about Dynamesh and subdivision levels, the ZBrush interface, as well as navigation. Moving on from quick start, we'll take an in-depth look at the ZBrush interface. We'll talk about how to customize the interface and customize hotkeys, how to make our own brushes. We'll look at alphas, various sculpting tools and techniques, nanomesh, array mesh, insert multi-mesh, and much, much more. Those of you interested in 3D printing will be excited to hear that we have a chapter dedicated to preparing our models for 3D print using the ZBrush plugin Decimation Master. Not only does ZBrush do organic modeling, it also does hard surface. We'll look at the most common tools and techniques used for hard surface sculpting inside of ZBrush. We'll look at booleans, as well as polygon modeling with ZModeler, the topology brush, and ZRemesher. Now, ZBrush is not only a powerful sculpting tool, it's also a robust 3D paint program. We have in-depth tutorials on polypainting, using Spotlight, UV Master, as well as a demonstration of how to paint a creature skin from scratch using polypaint, as well as projecting photo reference to create a human skin texture from photography. We also look at the ZBrush renderer. I'll show you how to customize materials, customize your render settings, and how to create light caps using HDR images inside of ZBrush. We'll also look at the ZBrush to Keyshot bridge, so you can see how to take models out of ZBrush into Keyshot and render them in lighting environments and materials. We're also going to take a look at what's new in ZBrush 2020, exciting brushes like the extractor brushes, the history recall brush, and deco brush, as well as new tools such as adjust polypaint, as well as mask by polypaint, setting pull direction, and finding mesh thickness before 3D print, and much, much more. It's my expectation that at the end of this video series, you will be a confident intermediate ZBrush artist. You will be able to accomplish whatever type of sculpting or painting task you want to undertake in ZBrush 2020. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll see you in the first lesson.
Hello, in this chapter we're going to do what I call the Quick Start tutorial. This is a great place to start if you've never used ZBrush before, because what we're going to do is go through everything you need to know to jump right in and start sculpting. Through this process we're going to talk about the most commonly used brushes, technical operations, various tools and techniques, and we're going to use them while we learn them. So it's a great place to dive in and get working and learning at the same time. So when you start ZBrush, it'll look something like this. You may have the Lightbox open. The Lightbox is accessed with this button right here. This is simply a file browser. The Lightbox allows you to load any type of file that can be saved out of ZBrush. Here we have ZTools, which are the models that we sculpt on in ZBrush. Here we have a project folder. These are an entire ZBrush session. Project files contain every ZTool that's open at one time, including any textures, cameras, or lighting that you have set up in ZBrush. So it's a full ZBrush session that's been saved. We have arrays, fibers, materials, basically anything you can save out of ZBrush can be loaded in using the file browser, the Lightbox. So in the Lightbox tool menu, we're going to find Polysphere. The polysphere is my favorite sort of default ball of clay. I'll use this anytime I just want to start sketching something using Dynamesh. On the right-hand side of your screen here, you'll see that there is a tool menu. Now, if you don't have this for some reason, go to the top of your screen, click on Tool, and then click this little radio button right here, and it'll dock it on the side of your screen. The tool menu is the menu that allows us to access everything that relates to the particular object that we're sculpting on. This big button here is called a palette. If I click it, you see that it gives me access to all these different tools that are available. None of these we're actually going to use. We're going to load in the Z-sphere and sculpt on that. But I want you to notice that right now it's this orange S. However, if I double click the polysphere, it loads that Z tool into ZBrush, and it has now replaced the active tool on the palette. I'll close the Lightbox by pressing the Lightbox button, and now we're ready to actually start sculpting. So oftentimes the first thing that happens when someone loads up ZBrush and they get a model in is they do something like this. They just keep trying to sculpt, and it just keeps drawing new instances of the model on the canvas. Now this is not a 3D model right now. What's happening is I'm drawing the 3D model and then dropping it and drawing another one, basically embedding it into that background. It's essentially an image. If you ever find that this happens, that you've just got a bunch of models stuck on your screen, and most importantly that your cursor is white, press Control N. Control N, that will clear your canvas. Now I'll draw that model on the canvas again just by clicking and dragging with the Wacom pen. And then I'm going to come up here at the top of the screen and there's a button called Edit. This is Edit mode. And anything in ZBrush that has a hotkey, you'll see in the tooltip it gives the hotkey next to it. Here it's the letter T. So I'll press this button, or I'll press the letter T, and watch. My brush becomes red. In this thumbnail view, I can now see the object that I've just drawn on screen, and I've got access to this navigation here. So now this is a 3D model which I can actually sculpt on. I'm no longer drawing it on the canvas. I can move around it and sculpt on it. Let's undo those strokes. There we go. Okay. Now, how do we navigate? Because we're working with a sphere and it's hard to tell what's the front and sides, I'm going to turn on the floor plane here by pressing the floor grid button. Now, if I want to navigate in ZBrush, what I do is I click and drag on the background, and that will actually rotate around the object. Now, I can also come up here and click and drag this bust, and that will allow me to snap to various rotations, both orthographic and 3/4. I can also use this Gnomon here to select different axes. So what I want to do is I just want to make sure that I'm looking straight down the Z-axis of this sphere. Now, I want to sculpt with symmetry turned on. See here? I'm only sculpting on one side. So I'm going to press the X key, and that means that I'll sculpt on both sides of the sphere at the same time. It's very nice when you're sculpting in 3D that symmetry basically comes for free. If you were sculpting in clay, it's quite difficult to sculpt something physical that is symmetrical. In ZBrush, it's very, very easy to sculpt symmetrically. So we have to make a concerted effort to introduce some asymmetry into our creatures as we work on them. So now we've seen how to load in a Z tool, we've seen how to enter into edit mode, and how to turn on our X symmetry. Let's go back and take a deep look at navigation. So we've already said if you click and drag on the background, you're going to rotate. If I want to zoom, hold down the Alt key, click and hold down your pen on the Wacom tablet, let go of the Alt key, and then drag up and down. So that's Alt, press down with the pen, let go of Alt, and then drag your pen up and down, and that will zoom. If I want to move the object, I hold down the Alt key and just click and drag, and that moves it around the screen. Now, if at any point you lose your object off screen like that, press the F key, F as in frame. That is this button here, Fit Mesh to View. You see that hotkey is F. And if I want to zoom out a little bit, I hold down the Alt key, press and hold the Wacom pen, let go of Alt, and then drag up, and I'll zoom out. Now we want to start sculpting. To do that, we need to understand how to access our brushes and how to change the settings of those brushes. The brush palette is over here on the left-hand side of the screen, but as with most things in ZBrush, there is a hotkey for this. I'm going to press B for brush, and that brings up the brush palette wherever I happen to be. Now the brush palette is quite large. There's a whole lot of brushes in here. I want to start by using the Move brush. I just want to push and pull this sphere into the shape of a head. So to do that, I'm going to press M for Move. Now that limits the brush list down to just those brushes that begin with the letter M. And you see that there are these orange letters for each brush. Those are contextual hotkeys. Right now, in this menu only, these hotkeys will select these brushes. And you see they're arranged alphabetically, and Move is here. And the hotkey for Move is the letter V. So I'll press the V key, and I've now selected the Move brush. You see that it is now displayed here in the brush palette. Just like when we selected the polysphere, it displayed in the tool palette. Whatever your selection is will display in each of these palette windows. Now we have a Move brush. This allows us to click and drag and sort of move the mesh as if it's made of rubber or clay. I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. Now we need to understand how to change our brush size and intensity. So up here at the top of the screen, you'll see there is a draw size slider. If I click and drag this, it'll change my draw size. There's also a focal shift slider. That's the innermost circle, and that controls the fall off of the brush. And then lastly, we have Z intensity. This controls the intensity of the brush, how strong it is. You'll also notice the brush is set to Z-add, and that means that it's adding as you work. That's most important on things like the clay tubes brush and the standard brush. It doesn't really have that much of an effect on the Move brush. You'll also see that it's set to RGB. I'll just turn that off because we're not painting, we're just going to be sculpting right now. Now this is where you go to change your brush settings, but I prefer using a hotkey for this. Instead of moving up to the top of the screen over and over again, I like to press the space bar. If you press and hold the space bar, it'll give you access to these sliders wherever your cursor may be. And you'll also notice that these individual sliders have hotkeys. Draw size is S, so if I press the S key, it just brings up the draw size. If I were to press the U key, it'll just bring up Z intensity. So you can bring up just those particular sliders, but I find it very convenient just to use the space bar and access all of them at one time. So I'll change my draw size and change my focal shift. And we're on the move brush now, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start clicking and dragging. And you see this moves the mesh around as though it were made out of, rubber or clay. So I'm going to create the shape of an egg or an oval from the front, and then we'll just snap to a side view here. I'm going to take this brush and make the cranial mass of this head. And then let's rotate to a top view and continue working on it from the top view. I'll just rotate 3/4 here and just pull these shapes up. There we go. Now, anytime that I'm sculpting, if I want to smooth the mesh, press and hold the Shift key. Your cursor becomes blue, and now I'm smoothing. So you see this smooths down the vertices. Let go of Shift, and I'm back to my move brush, and I can continue working as normal. So we're going to sketch in just an interesting kind of alien head as a learning exercise. So we'll just create something kind of fantasy and interesting to begin with. So now we've seen how to navigate. We've seen how to access our brushes. Let's choose a different brush now. Let's go to B for brush, S for standard. And we're going to select the standard brush. That's the hotkey T. The standard brush is kind of a standard ZBrush brush. It simply adds like that. Or if I hold down the Alt key, it will subtract. So what I want to do with this brush is I just want to sketch in some eye sockets and start to get just the basic sort of anatomy of this head. Let's get the angle of the jaw in here. Start thinking about the structure of the brow. And now I'm going to go back to my move brush. That's B, M, V. Change my draw size. And I'm going to start shifting around these shapes a little bit. Whenever I'm working in ZBrush, I think it's really important to always look at your character from various points of view. I'm going to turn off the floor plane now so I can see clearly from the underside. I want to make sure that the face isn't sitting flat on a flat plane, so I'm going to look at it from the top and bottom and just make sure that things like the brow line and the sort of barrel of the mouth all have some dimension to them. I'm going to adjust this nasal structure here. We're kind of just sketching an idea, so not entirely sure where we're going to go with this. I just know that I want it to be humanoid. Let's spread those eye sockets out a bit and bring this chin forward and the angle of the mandible, the jaw. Now, I want to select a different brush. I'm going to select the Clay Tubes brush. To do that, I'll do B for brush, C for clay, and here you see the Clay Tubes brush. Don't select Clay Buildup, select Clay Tubes. Clay Buildup is a very aggressive brush, but Clay Tubes is a nice, somewhat subtle brush that I find really good for sketching. I'll select that brush, change my draw size. Now you'll notice this brush has an alpha associated with it. This square alpha is the tip of the brush. Alphas here are grayscale images that serve as your brush shape. So this square alpha allows us to get an effect like this. It's a very sketchy, sort of noisy brush that doesn't have that perfectly refined 3D look to it. It builds up somewhat aggressively, and I find it really, really nice because it makes the surface sort of feel like wet clay, like I'm using a spatula just to build up clay on the surface. So I'm just going to use this to kind of sketch in some bone structure. If I hold down the Alt key, I can use this to subtract, and I can knock back a little plane there under the cheekbone. Build up the muzzle, build up the nose again. Here we go. Now I want to make some changes to the cranial mass at the back of the head. So I'm going to go to B for brush, M for magnify, and I'm going to select the magnify brush here. And the magnify brush I think is really nice just for sort of enlarging areas. And of course it's quite aggressive by default, so I'll just turn down my Z intensity and that makes it a little bit more subtle. I just want to give that sort of classic oversized alien cranium look here. Now as I'm working, if I turn on frame mode here, you see the hotkey for that is Shift F. I can see the polygons of the mesh that I'm working on. What we're doing right now is we're using subdivision models. We're using a model that has multiple subdivision levels. So under the tool menu, if I go to the geometry submenu here and open it, you see there's a slider. Now this is how ZBrush generally works. You import a polygon object or create a polygon object in ZBrush, and then you add subdivisions to it. You multiply its subdivision or its number of faces to give more and more geometry to create more and more detail. Now we're only going to be using subdivision levels very briefly. We're going to switch to something called Dynamesh in just a moment, but I want to touch on this in the quick start so you understand what we're seeing right now. If I take this slider and bring it down to the lowest subdivision level, you see that's actually the most basic level of this model. You can see every individual polygon. If I want to step back up my subdivision levels, I press the D key. You see that slider increments up one at a time. If I want to step down, I press Shift D. So what I like to do is, in the very, very beginnings of my sculpture, step down to my lowest subdivision level, and I like to sculpt down here because it allows you to make very, very large shape changes very, very quickly. It's something that's particular to working with subdivision levels, which is not something that we're going to be able to do when we do Dynamesh. There's sort of a trade-off between these two methods of sculpting. And we have an entire other video where we just talk about sculpting with subdivision levels, but I want to get you started quickly right now, so we're going to use Dynamesh, which is really, really good for sketching. But before we do that, I just want to go ahead and get the most basic shapes of this character established. I want to get the bone structure dialed in and get a good start on things. And that's really important. Whenever you're sculpting in ZBrush, always think about your most basic shapes first. That way you start to build things up and make them more complicated and more refined level by level, and it becomes more and more realistic. If you work with a mesh that has too many subdivision levels right out of the gate, your divisions are going to get in your way. The polygons, you'll have more polygons than you need, and that's why often beginner ZBrush models can look a little lumpy, just because people are dealing with too many polygons right out of the gate. So I'm going to step back up to my highest subdivision level now and turn off frame mode, either by pressing this button or pressing Shift F. Now I want to show you something called masking. I'm going to hold down the Control key and I'm going to mask out the brow area and the ocular orbits, the cheekbones here. Now this gray area here, when I hold down the Control key, my cursor becomes yellow. That tells me that I'm painting a mask. If I want to subtract from the mask, I press Control Alt and then I can erase it. If I want to clear the mask, I Control, click, and drag on the background. If I want to invert the mask, I hold down the Control key and just tap on the background, and that inverts the area that's masked. So if you look now, if I were to take my Clay Tubes brush and try and sculpt on this area, it's only going to affect the area that is unmasked. So I'm going to feather the edges of this mask just to soften it. I do that by holding the Control key and then clicking on the masked area a few times, and you see it feathers the edges. Now I'll go back to my Move brush, and I'm just going to spread the eye sockets a bit. I just wanted to spread the structure out and sort of change its angles here. I want to give it a little bit of malicious intent, make it a little bit intimidating here. Spread these cheekbones out. Clear the mask by clicking and Control clicking and dragging on the background. Select my Clay Tubes brush and let's just build out those cheekbones. Let's connect that to the back of the head a little bit better. I'll go to my Move brush and pull these shapes out as well so they're matching up. Again, I'm going to move to the top view and just make sure that things aren't, falling into a single plane, that I can keep things, quite dimensional. There we go. And we're getting some interesting shapes here now. Just using the Move brush to make these adjustments. I'm going to change my Move brush size and just really push the shape of that cranium. Go back to my Clay Tubes brush and build up that temporal ridge there, that sort of edge of the skull. Hold down the Alt key and I can knock back a bit of a hollow in there. Build up the muscle at the corner of the jaw there, the masseter muscle. And I'll go to my standard brush. That's B as in brush, S as in standard, and then the hotkey T. Hold down the Alt key, and I'm just going to knock back those eye sockets a little bit more again. Go back to my Move brush. Look at the underside here. I definitely want to pull out the face, so it is happening around sort of an oval or cylindrical form, and it's not sitting flat. Now, as I work, you might notice this thumbnail view up here in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. If I click and drag that, I can enlarge that. The thumbnail view is there to help you see the design silhouette of what you're working on. all through graphic design, industrial design, and creature design, we're always concerned with what's called the first read. That is the overall silhouette of the creature that you're working on. If you think of any of your favorite characters, it could be Gandalf the Grey, it could be Giger's Alien, it could be, really any iconic creature or character. They have a silhouette that stands out. They have an overall shape that is recognizable. And that's why we have this view here, so we can see the silhouette as we're working. It helps us focus on those basic shapes. And that's a really important thing in sculpting and design that is often overlooked, or people don't learn until well into their education, is that you should always be thinking about your silhouette, because that's the first thing the eye sees. And if it's confusing or muddled or it's not very exciting, the character will never be particularly interesting. So it's really nice that Pixelogic added this view in ZBrush 2020 that allows you to focus in on those areas, that look, and make sure that you're getting something that feels interesting. I'm just going to spread those cheekbones out a little bit more. And I'm going to change the shape there. And I'm just going to shrink that thumbnail view back down. If you don't want the thumbnail view there, you can always press this button to turn it off. Now, if you want to turn off your perspective camera, press the P key, and that drops you into a straight orthographic view. And I find that it's actually useful sometimes to look at things orthographically and switch back to perspective. It just helps me get perspective, so to speak, on what I'm working on. Now I'm going to go back to my clay tubes brush, and I'm going to turn off the alpha now. I'm going to click in the alpha menu here, and I'm going to select alpha off. I'm going to take my focal shift and turn that down. Now this is going to make a much more subtle brush. Watch what happens now when I build up with the brush. You see how it's very subtle and smooth? It's still a sketchy kind of brush, but it gets rid of that sort of noisy look that I wanted at the very beginning. I think that that's a very nice thing to have when you're first sketching in your character. It helps keep you loose and gestural, and you don't feel like you're already in the last stages of your model. So what I will do here is I'm going to switch back to my move brush. I'm just going to shift that temporal ridge a little bit, get that bone structure light dialed in there. I'm going to go back to my clay tubes brush, and I'm going to fill out that temporal fossa, that hollow at behind the cheekbone, just with the sense of there being a temporalis muscle in there. I just want to fill that out just a little bit. Okay, so we've got our basic shapes dialed in. Now we're going to continue working on this, obviously, but I want to illustrate for you the limitation that subdivision models have, which is why we're going to use Dynamesh. I'm going to add another subdivision level to this model by pressing Ctrl D. That's the same as coming over here to the geometry menu and pressing divide. You'll notice the subdivision levels have now gone from 3 to 4. That means I've added another subdivision level, and I am up to 98,000 polygons. I'm going to roll around to the underside of the mesh here, and I'm going to press the Control key. So I'm in masking mode, and let me switch back to my mask pen. Here we go. I'm going to go into masking mode, and I'm going to mask out where the neck will come from. I will Control click on the background to invert that mask. And now I'm going to go to the move brush, turn my draw size up, and I'm just going to click and drag to drag the neck out. Now, if I go into polyframe mode by pressing Shift F, you can see what happens here. Those faces are getting stretched. What this means is I can't take this sphere and build out a neck and a shoulders and torso from it, because inevitably I'm going to run out of geometry. No matter how many times I subdivide, it's still somewhat beholden to the original volume of that sphere. This is the shortcoming of subdivision modeling when you're trying to do ideation or sketch something, or just sketch an idea out in ZBrush. Ultimately, you're locked into mostly the volume of that sphere. That's where Dynamesh comes in. I'm going to undo, clear the mask, and we'll turn off frame mode. Under the Tool Geometry menu, there's a submenu called Dynamesh right here. We have a resolution slider. I'm going to set this slider to about 80. Remember I said that we don't want to deal with millions of polygons right out of the gate. We always want to work at the lowest number of polygons that can get the shapes we're trying to make. It's good discipline. It helps you keep your models smooth and nice looking. It keeps the form coherent. If you're dealing with 2 million polygons while you're trying to sculpt, that's too many to deal with if you haven't already established the most basic forms. So that's something important to keep in mind. So I'm going to press the Dynamesh button here, and it will always ask you if you have subdivision levels, do you want to freeze them? Say no. Now, it doesn't look like anything happened, but if I go into frame mode, you can see the mesh has now been dynamically remeshed, hence Dynamesh, into all these little squares. I'll undo that and do it again. Here we have the subdivision level 4, which is all these quads. I press oops. There we go. Press Dynamesh. I'm actually going to set this to 80 again because that's too high. There we go. Here we have our Dynameshed mesh. And you see Dynameshing is just slicing up the mesh into basically a shrink-wrapped series of little quads. Now what's important about Dynamesh is this. I'm going to turn off frame mode, and I'm going to repeat that process with the neck. I'm going to mask out where the neck would come from. Control-click on the background to invert the mask. I'm going to take my move brush, BMV, turn my draw size up, and I'm going to stretch that neck down. Let's try and get the generalized shape of this character's neck. We'll go to the back here, spread out the beginnings of the shoulders, the trapezius muscles. You see things are very, very stretched out now. If I go back into frame mode, look how everything is stretched out. But watch this. Because I am in Dynamesh mode, this only works in Dynamesh. If I control, click, and drag on the background, I currently have a mask on the mesh, so that clears the mask. If you do not have a mask on your mesh, and you control, click, and drag on the background, that executes Dynamesh. It will dynamically remesh this model, slicing it all up into these evenly spaced little quads. So watch the neck. Watch what happens. When I control, click, and drag on the background, it Dynameshes. That's dynamically remeshing. So I don't have to worry about the volumes of the mesh that I'm working on. I'll do that again. Here I've stretched the neck out. I still have a mask on the head itself. Control, click, and drag on the background clears the mask. Control, click, and drag again executes Dynamesh. So anytime Dynamesh is turned on and you control, click, and drag on the background, it'll dynamically remesh the model. And there's no limit to how many times you can Dynamesh. I constantly Dynamesh while I'm working. So I'll take my move brush and start shifting stuff around. We'll turn off frame mode because we don't really need to see those polygons anymore. And I'm just going to adjust the shapes of the neck here. I'm going to roll around to the underside, go to the clay tubes brush. Let's fill out where the trachea is and the anatomy of the neck here. We'll come up here and start to build up the sternocleidomastoid muscles to start to get the shapes of the neck in here. And let's say I want to make some further changes to the cranium. I'm going to go ahead and mask out the cranium. We'll stretch the mesh out again. Invert that mask and go to the magnify brush. And let's just magnify this again. We'll take our move brush, really push this. Clear the mask. Do a few more changes. Now watch, control, click, and drag. It dynamically remeshes. So I'm going to stop going into frame mode now because I think it should be pretty clear what Dynamesh is doing. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to my clay tubes brush and hold down the Alt key so I can subtract in the temporal ridge or the temporal fossa here, the hollows of the skull on the sides. And I'm just going to start building up some shapes here. I'm constantly using that spacebar to change my draw size and Z intensity as I work. Again, let's build up those muscles of the neck. We'll go to our standard brush. Hold down the Alt key and I'll just create the little hollow here at the pit of the neck. And hold down the Shift key and I can smooth that back a little bit. Go back to my move brush. Continue shifting shapes around here. Let's zoom into the face and I'll go back to my clay tubes brush. Again, I have turned the alpha off on this brush. So here I'm just going to start thinking around what the nose might be like, the furrows in the brow here. Connect the cheekbones to the mouth. Get those muscles that attach the zygomaticus major and minor, the muscles that attach from the cheekbone down to the corners of where the mouth will be. We'll just start sketching those in. Now I'm going to select a different brush, one of my favorite brushes. This is the Dam Standard brush. If I press B for brush, D for Dam, you see Dam Standard is first in the list. It's the letter S. This is a really nice brush for sort of sketching in little creases and wrinkles. So I'm just using this to sort of sketch in some depressions here in the model. Sketching it may have folds of flash and wrinkles and whatnot. It's really good for also drapery as well. Holding the shift key and smoothing as I go. Go back to my clay tubes brush. Just building up the undersides of those eye sockets a little bit. Go back to my move brush. Let's just spread that mouth open or wider a little bit so we've got more area to play with when we get to sculpting the lips. I'll go to my standard brush, and I'm just going to just start adjusting this nose shape here. If I want to make my standard brush a little more fine, I'll go to the Alpha menu and select Alpha 1. Again, alphas are gray shaded images that form the tip of your brush. So this just makes that brush a little bit more refined, a little bit sharper. So we're going to go ahead and create this strange nose shape here. Go back to my clay tubes brush, holding down the Alt key to just knock back those shapes a bit. And we'll build up the muzzle a little bit more in the jawline. Speaking of the jawline, I'm going to roll down to the bottom here, and I'm going to go to B for brush, M for move. And I want to change how wide that jaw actually is. Now you'll notice what happens now, because I'm in Dynamesh mode, I no longer have subdivision levels. So when I want to make these big shape changes, I have to do them on the mesh as it is. And that's one reason why I make sure to set my resolution lower to start with. We can always increase that later. You can always just turn that slider up, and the next time you Dynamesh, it will actually increase the overall polygon count and give you more to work with. I'm going to go back to my damn standard brush. Again, let's start creating some striations through here. I like to sketch just really loose and gesturally across the surface. Sometimes I'll even turn off X symmetry, especially here at the center line of the head where the brow furrow is, because brows very rarely furrow perfectly symmetrically. So it gives you a nice little touch of realism. I'm going to go into my move brush again. Incidentally, I have all of my brushes hotkeyed, and I'll be showing you in a later lesson how to hotkey those brushes. It makes it a lot faster to work. Go to my clay tubes brush again, and just want to build up a little furrow there. Go to my damn standard brush, create a nice little crease here and here. You see already we're getting this nice asymmetrical furrow through the brow. Let's bring some wrinkles up through here. And then I'm just going to traverse some more wrinkles across. Now these wrinkles don't have to be the final sculpture. A lot of times people approach sculpting in ZBrush as if every mark they put down has to be perfect. And it's not. It's a sketching tool. Just like sketching in water-based clay or oil clay or sketching in a sketchbook, use it to develop ideas and feel free to erase things as you go. Just hit it with a smooth brush and you can knock it back. So I'm going to turn on my X symmetry again. I just want to start thinking about the inner portion of that eye socket there. Come around to the back of the head here, create a little wrinkle there at the back of the head, and then go to my standard brush. Again, I have that alpha on the standard brush, so it's a little bit more fine. I can create some folds of skin here, and then use the smooth brush just to knock them back a bit, and smooth back the back of the neck a little. So I'm going to take my damn standard brush now, B for brush, D for damn, S for standard, and I'm just going to sketch in the line between the lips. I just want to get an idea of where the lips will fall here. Now I'm going to hold down the Alt key. The Alt key makes the damn standard brush pinch. So I'm going to pinch the shape of the upper lip, like that. Now I'm going to take the masking brush, that's just holding down the Control key, and I'm going to mask out where the lower lip will be. I'm going to invert that mask by Control-clicking on the background, and I'm going to go to my standard brush, and I'm just going to start sketching in the shape of the lower lip. I want to remove some of the mask here, so I'm going to press Control and Alt, and I can paint out some of this chin, because I want to sculpt down into that. Pretty soon we're going to need to increase our subdivision levels so we can get a little bit more detail here. So I'm going to go to B for brush, M for move, V, and I'm going to take the move brush and I'm just going to tug the upper lip under, or the lower lip under the upper lip, just slightly. And I'm going to sort of increase its volume a little bit, just using the move brush. I'm going to go back to my clay tubes brush, again with no alpha, and I'm just going to build up the sort of orbicularis oris muscle. It's this little W shape that you might recognize that happens at the bottom of the mouth sometimes. I'm going to hold down the Alt key and push this center portion in just a tick. There we go. I'm going to clear my mask, Control, click, and drag. That executes Dynamesh. Now you see what's happened here. The Dynamesh has actually glued the lips together a little bit. It's lost some of the detail that we put in there. So I'll undo that. I'll go to my resolution, and this time I'll set it to, let's set it to 100. You can do some trial and error here. It doesn't matter. You can always undo it and then redo it. So I'm going to Control, click, and drag now, and you see that it's not as bad. It's keeping a lot of that detail now. You also see that our resolution is much higher. If I were to turn this up again, let's set it to 128. Now I will Control, click, and drag again, and it's even denser with more detail. But be careful, once again, don't Dynamesh to such a high resolution that you're giving yourself too much geometry to work with. I can come in here and I can refine this further, and then we can always up the resolution once again. So here at the corners of the mouth, I want to create what are called the nodes of the lips. These are sort of little puckered donuts of skin on either side of the lips. It's created because there's several muscles grabbing this point. There's the zygomaticus major and minor, there's the buccinator, and the depressor anguli oris. All of these muscles are grabbing this one point here at the corner of the mouth. So you end up getting this very interesting little puckered donut shape. So I'm just using the clay tubes brush with a very low Z intensity and no alpha to build up that shape at the corners of the mouth. Now I'm going to go to B for brush, I for inflate, and I'm going to select the inflate brush here. The inflate brush is one of my favorite brushes. It's great for just sort of puckering shapes together. We're just going to use it to sort of create a little bit of a pucker there at the corners of the lips. Control, click, and drag, and that executes Dynamesh. I'm going to mask out the lower lip, invert that mask, and I'm just going to very gently pucker that lower lip a little bit. And that creates a nice little ledge there that's actually quite realistic. There usually is a little ledge at the bottom of the lower lip. Let's go ahead and accentuate that using the Damn Standard brush and execute Dynamesh. Now we can move away from the mouth for a moment. Now let's talk about adding more volume to this character. Now, of course, I can push and pull the mesh as much as I want to. Let's say, for example, somebody says, hey, we need some antenna on this, like a classic sort of Martian. So I'll just mask out where I want these antennae to come from, invert that mask, and then I can just take the move brush. Take the move brush and let's just pull out where these antennae will come from. I'm stretching these faces quite a bit. Control, click, and drag once clears the mask. I'm going to turn on frame mode again. Control, click, and drag a second time executes Dynamesh. Turn off frame mode, and I'll just smooth this back a little bit. I'm going to take the inflate brush once again, hold down the Alt key, and I can sort of taper these by inflating them in the negative. Smooth that back. And then let's go to our inflate brush once again and just sort of inflate little bulbs on the end of that. Very classic kind of antenna that you see in like a 1950s Martian design. Come down here to the base and go to my Damn Standard brush. And I'm just going to create some sense that these antennae have some wrinkles around them, or they're joined, married in some way to the base. To the head itself. I don't want them to just grow out of nothing. We'll go to our standard brush, B, S, T. Turn down my Z intensity a little bit more than that, and I'll just build up some of these wrinkles a little bit. There we go. Take our move brush. Oops. This is good that this happened. I accidentally hit the V hotkey. The V hotkey switches your color. So I'm just going to press the V hotkey to switch back to white. By the way, I should also mention, if your material is not something that you like working on, for example, a lot of times people end up with the red wax material. This is not something that I like to sculpt on. If you want to change the material of your object, go to the material palette here and just select a material that appeals to you. I think the best material is the basic material 2. It's pretty much a blend shader. It's got a highlight, a midtone, and a core shadow. And it shows you all your mistakes. And I think that's really important while you're working, that you can see everything very, very clearly. A lot of people elect to sculpt on something like Matcap Gray, which can actually hide a lot of problems in the model. So I choose not to use that. I'll show models in Matcap Gray, but I try not to sculpt in it because it makes it a little difficult for me to see what I'm doing sometimes. So I'll switch back to basic material 2. If you want this material to be your default material every time you start ZBrush, just select it and then go down here to the bottom of the material palette and click Save as Startup Material. And that's how I have mine set to be the basic material 2 every time I start ZBrush. So if I click that, there's my startup material there, basic material 2. So I want to create some little ears on here. I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to mask out the shape of an ear. I'm going to invert that mask. And now I'm going to take the move brush and I'm going to pull that ear shape out. It's just the most basic shape of a little baby ear there. There we go. I'm going to control, click, and drag once to clear the mask. Control, click, and drag a second time to execute Dynamesh. Now we can smooth across that. I'll take the inflate brush. Just start to inflate the outermost border of the ear. It's called the conch of the ear. And I will go to the standard brush. Hold down the Alt key and just sort of push back the area behind the ear. Might even use the move brush for this as well. I just want to click and drag just to get some draft behind the ear. There we go. And still in my move brush, I'm just going to change the shape of that ear a little bit. And I'm going to go back to my standard brush. And I'm going to mask out the entire inside of the ear here. Control click on the background to invert the mask. Now I'll take my move brush and I'm just going to hold down the Alt key and it'll just push those faces straight in when I click and drag. Holding down the Alt key with the move brush will either push or pull the faces in or out. So I'm just going to push those in slightly. Let's clear the mask and Dynamesh that. Still on my move brush, I'm just adjusting the shapes of the ear here. I'm going to go to the standard brush and I'm going to push in the ear hole, the auditory meatus. Let's turn up the Z intensity a little bit. Holding down the Alt key, let's push that in. And now I'm going to build up the little nubbin of skin right here. That's called the tragus. And I'm going to extend the conch of the ear, or the helix of the ear, I mean, down inside the body of the ear like that. Hold down the Alt key. There we go. Now we're starting to get that little Y-shaped bit inside the ear. Control, click, and drag. Executes Dynamesh. As long as you don't have a mask on the model, when you control, click, and drag, it will execute Dynamesh as long as you're in Dynamesh mode. There we go. So now we have some little ears on here. Well, since it's an alien, we really should just go ahead and follow the classic shape language that we have and go ahead and give him a little pointed ear. So to do that, we'll go back to our damp standard brush, sort of accentuate that shadow, that draft between the helix and anti-helix of the ear. And I'll hold down the Alt key and that gives a little bit of a pinch with the damp standard stroke. Add some wrinkles up here. So now we've got some nice pointed ears on our Martian. Use the move brush just to adjust the shape of that from the front view. Now I want to save my work. Now there's two ways to do this. When you save in ZBrush, you're going to save in one of two places. Under the tool menu, if you click Save As, that will save the current Z tool. Now a Z tool is just the current model that I'm working on and any textures that are associated with that. The other way you can save is to go to File, Save As. If you go to File, Save As, that saves a project file. That's the same as Control S. That saves the entire ZBrush session. So if I have multiple Z tools open, it'll save them all, any textures, lighting, anything you have set up in ZBrush. So press Control S to save a project, since that will save everything that we have going, and it's a very convenient way to start saving. It makes a large file size, but when you're just starting out, it's easy to remember Control S. Now there's also Quick Save up here at the top of the screen. Now ZBrush will save as you're working. So if you go to the Lightbox and go to the Quick Save folder, you can see all the different Quick Save files that are there. So if you have a crash, go check there and find your most recent Quick Save that ZBrush automatically saved for you. So I'm just going to save my work now with Control S, creating a project file which has everything loaded into it. So now that we've saved our Z project, let's take a look at how we can add more volume to this character. Now, of course, if I wanted to put shoulders in, I could mask out the area, invert the mask, and then take something like the inflate brush and inflate the shoulder area out, take the move brush, and then shift it further, clear the mask, and then execute Dynamesh. And then I can just push and pull the mesh like this. But I want to show you a different technique that I think is very, very cool and unique to Dynamesh. I'm going to undo back to where we were. And we're going to select a different brush this time. We're going to go to B for brush, I for insert, and now you see there's a selection of brushes that are IMM. That stands for Insert Multiple Mesh. I'm going to go to IMM Primitives, which is the T hotkey. And this gives me a list of primitive shapes up here at the top of the screen. We're just going to select Sphere 32 or Insert Sphere, either one of those. And we're going to come down here and click and drag. And what this does is it inserts two spheres and it masks out the rest of the model. Now this makes it very easy for us to move and shape these spheres into the shoulders. Now to do that, we're going to use a different type of tool. We're currently in draw mode, which means that we're sculpting with brushes. But if I change to move, which is the W hotkey, I now have this gizmo here. And this would be very familiar to anyone that's been in a 3D modeling application before. It has a selection of icons up at the top, and then it's got your usual Gnomon, your X, Y, and Z axes for both rotation, moving, and scaling. If it happens to be off-center, just unlock it and hit the reset button and then lock the pivot again. And I'll just click the corners here and I'm just going to drag them more or less into position. Turn off perspective mode. And now I'm going to go back to draw mode, which if we mouse over it, you see is the Q hotkey. We'll go to the move brush, and I'm just going to use the move brush to sort of shape these spheres into the shoulders and chest, or the beginnings of the shoulders and chest. Just going to move them together like this, bring this down. We'll take the inflate brush, inflate them together a little bit. Go back to our move brush and just start adjusting it to fit. We're just going to create a bust for this tutorial, so we're not going to take the shoulders down too far. But I want to get the beginnings of the shoulders and chest, so it's a reasonable place to end the bust, so it doesn't feel like it's just cut off at the neck. Bring this up here, and then I'll go into frame mode again so you can see what happens. If I control click and drag once, it clears the mask that it put on the head itself, and then control click and drag a second time and it will dynamesh those spheres into the model. It has now made those one continuous mesh. If we zoom in, you can see it's actually blending in. So let's go out of frame mode with Shift F, turn our brush size up, go to the smooth brush, and let's just smooth back those facets. There's no actual faceting in the geometry, that's just an artifact from where we had the faceting in the original mesh. Go to our clay tubes brush, let's build up the sternum, build up the clavicles, like this. Let's extend out the anatomy of the neck to make contact there. Let's go to our standard brush, hold down the Alt key, and we'll knock back a little hollow here. Back to our move brush and shift these shapes around and smooth. Come back here, go to our clay tubes brush, and let's fix that transition up into the neck. Make sure that we don't lose the shapes of the sternomastoid there. I'm going to go in with the standard brush, and I want to create a little hollow right here between what is the deltoid and the pectoralis muscles. You see that the clavicle has 3/3 to it. It looks like a set of handlebars. So this little hollow is going to go right here. Just hold down the Alt key and just push that in. It's just a nice little anatomical landmark that helps make things feel a little bit more realistic. We can smooth that back and then go back to our clay tubes brush and sort of build up the striations in the pectoralis muscles here. Start to suggest the deltoid here. Roll around to the back of the model, sort of build these shapes out a little bit. Remember again that you can hold down the Alt key while you're using the clay tubes brush, and it does knock back a nice plane. It helps subtract a little bit in a very pleasing way. Holding down the Alt key, I'm just going to knock back a little plane right here. Build up that little landmark there. Go back to our standard brush and just accentuate the pit of the neck right there. Turn down my draw size, get that nice little bifurcation there, and then smooth that back a bit. I'll go to my damn standard brush. I find the damn standard brush really nice for getting the flow of muscles. So I'm just going to stroke along the striations in those pectoralis muscles. And we'll turn off X-symmetry and go to our move brush. Again, we want to try and introduce asymmetry whenever we can. We don't want to, make everything asymmetrical to the point that it doesn't look realistic. We want to introduce a realistic amount of asymmetry, especially once we get closer to like the center line of the character here. I'm going to go ahead and create a little sense of a tendon stretching across here, maybe one coming down through here, really pushing it down in the hollow there, so I'm building up in that recess. And then I'll hold down the Alt key, and I'm just going to catch a little bit of shadow on either side of it just to deepen that and accentuate that look. Go back to our clay tubes brush. Hold down the Alt key, just knock that back just a little bit. Go back to our move brush, turn on X symmetry, just make some further adjustments here. I'm going to turn up the intensity on my move brush just so it's a little bit stronger and I can pull these shoulders, these deltoids down a little bit. There we go. So we can continue adding spheres like that to build up the entirety of the character. Again, Dynamesh means you don't have to worry about the underlying topology. You don't have to worry about the underlying volumes of your model at all. You can basically continue to add spheres like balls of clay, Dynamesh them together, and continue sculpting. Let's look now how we would add a sphere that we didn't want to blend into the model. How do we work with multiple Z tools together at the same time? Those are called subtools. I'm going to save my work here, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Subtools are a collection of multiple Z tools. If I go to the tool menu here and open up the demo soldier, which comes with ZBrush by default, this is a model made up of multiple subtools. If I go to the tool menu and open up the subtool palette, you'll see that there are a selection of different models here. Each one of these is a separate subtool, but they're grouped together and they move together. And if I were to Alt-click on any one of these subtools, it will select it from this list. And I can then individually divide this or Dynamesh it and sculpt on it or paint on it. Each one of these is its own subtool. So what I want to do is I want to create subtools for our alien head. I want to give him a pair of eyeballs. So to do that, I need to get a sphere into my tool palette here. I need to have a sphere available. Currently I don't. I just have the one that we've been sculpting on. And if you see here, there's the demo soldier, which we just loaded up. So both of the tools that we've loaded are currently in the tool palette. I want to create a sphere, so I'm going to go to the light box and I'm going to load up a brand new polysphere. Now it looks like the model is gone that we were working on, but it's not. It's still right here. If I select it, there's our alien. Now I will go to append, and this opens up the tool palette, and there's the polysphere there. If I select that, it's now been added to my subtool list. Now we can't see it because it's actually sitting inside the head, but if I turn on transparency mode here and perhaps turn off ghost mode, you can see it more clearly. There's the sphere sitting inside the head. So I'm going to turn off my X symmetry, and I'm going to go to W for move mode. Now my pivot is no longer sitting in the center of that sphere, so I'm going to unlock it, and I'm going to click this button here, go to Unmask Mesh Center. Oops, I'm actually on the head, I'm not on the sphere. That's why it snapped to the center of the head. So I need to make sure that I have the sphere selected, and I'll do that by clicking it in the subtool palette. There we go. Now our pivot is at the center of the sphere. I will lock the pivot again, and then I'll just move it off to the side, and I will scale it down with the center scale option there. I'm going to move it into the eye socket, scale it to be about the right size. Like so. Now I'm going to select the head again, and I'm going to leave transparency turned on so I can see through the sphere to the faces behind it. I'm going to go to the Clay Tubes brush now, and I'm just going to mask out the inside of the eye socket and invert the mask. And using the Clay Tubes brush, I'm going to build up all those faces so they're sitting in front of that eyeball sphere. So I'm basically building out the faces from behind the sphere that we just added. Just like that. If we turn off transparency now, you can see we're basically building up the outside of the eyelids. I'm going to clear my mask. I'm going to take my brush size, turn it down, and I'm going to mask out the shape of an open eye. Just like this. We actually want to make sure that we turn on X symmetry when we do this. Actually, I'm going to have to undo a few times because my X symmetry was not turned on when I built out those faces. So let's undo that. Let's mask again, this time with X symmetry turned on. You have to be careful about losing your symmetry by turning off X symmetry and then forgetting it's turned off. But there's actually ways around that. If you do end up losing your symmetry, it's not a problem. We can actually reintroduce it quite easily. We have an entire video chapter on that where we talk about reintroducing symmetry where you've lost it. And it's very, very easy, especially with Dynamesh. Here we go. Let's mask all that out. Invert the mask, go to our Clay Tubes brush, turn off Solo. I'm pressing Solo to isolate the current Z tool. If I turn on Solo, I only see the Z tool that I'm working on. So there we go. Let's build those faces out one more time. There we go. Let's smooth them back. Let's turn off transparency mode and then clear the mask. Now I will mask the shape of an open eyelid. Remember, Control-Alt will subtract from the mask. There we go. Now I'm going to Control-Click on the background. That inverts my masked area. I'm going to take the Move brush, turn up my draw size, and then hold down the Alt key and click and drag, and that pushes those faces back into the head, revealing the eye. Let's Control, click, and drag on the background just to get rid of the mask. And I'll use the Move brush now to tug those eyelids up against the eyeball. Now I haven't Dynameshed yet. I want to get these a little closer to exactly where I want them before I Dynamesh. Take the Move brush, shift these down, smooth them just a little bit, and then I'll take the Standard brush, just sort of build up the edges of the eyelid here. I'm going to mask out the upper lid, and I'm going to take the lower lid with the Move brush, zoom in here and just tug that in and up a little bit just to get the nice corner of the eye there. Now, oops. Get that shape just right. And I'm going to go to my Damn Standard brush, and I'm just going to start sketching in the underside of the eye socket. Let's turn up the Z intensity just a little bit. I just want to get that nice sort of bag under the eye there. Go to our Clay Tubes brush again. Build up that nice soft tissue there. Go back to our Damn Standard brush. And I'm going to start thinking about the crease in the upper lid here. Let's turn up our Z intensity a little bit more and just get that crease in there. Let's put a few of those there. There we go. Go back to our move brush, just adjust that a little bit. And now we're ready to Dynamesh. Control, click, and drag on the background, and it will Dynamesh the mesh. Now, of course, we only have one eyeball now. We want that eyeball to mirror over the opposite side. So I will select the eyeball sphere. I'm going to save my work before I do this. I think it's very important to always save often when you're working in ZBrush. You can always just press the quick save button there, which is the hotkey is number 9, but I just like to manually save. So with the eyeball subtool selected, go to Z plugin. Under Z plugin, you'll find Subtool Master. Under Subtool Master, you'll find Mirror. I want to make sure that Merge into one subtool is selected and across the X-axis is selected. So that will take that eyeball, it will mirror it across the X-axis and merge the two into one subtool. So if I click OK, I get two eyeballs like that. Select the head again, go back to our Move brush, and we can continue to finesse these shapes. I'm going to mask out the whole eye area again so I can work on the eyelids without worrying about impacting the brow structure, because I don't want to lose that. So let's bring that lid out a little bit more. We might actually go ahead and select the eyeballs now and go to our Move tool, and let's just adjust the depth in the head a little bit. We'll go back to the head, go back to our Move brush, and I just want to make sure that we get a nice thickness to the eyelids. A lot of times people neglect just how thick the eyelid can be. So we want to make sure that we get that. And now I'm going to go back to my Damn Standard brush, and a nice touch that you can do here is hold down the Alt key and just pinch the outermost edge of the eyelid. And that can help sharpen that and make it feel a lot nicer. Let's go ahead and put in some wrinkles here at the eye bags. Clear the mask. Now, I want there to be a little bit of sag in these wrinkles at the eye. I want it to feel like an eye bag. So I'm going to mask out up to the edge of that fold of flesh and invert the mask. Now I'm going to take the inflate brush, and with the inflate brush I'm going to inflate against the masked area, and you see it starts to sort of pucker that tissue over that masked area. I'll take the BMV for Move Brush. I'll take the Move Brush and I'll just gently tug that down like so. Go back to my Damn Standard brush and accentuate that, and then execute Dynamesh. There we go. Let's come up here into the top. Let's smooth that back a bit. Go back in with our Damn Standard brush, get a nice little crease there. Go in with my Clay Tubes brush, and let's just fill in that hollow just a little bit. Make sure we turn off X symmetry, because this is an area that we deliberately introduced some asymmetry to. Go back to our Damn Standard brush and just create some nice creases in here. There we go. Going to go back to the Move brush, just taking a step back, turn on our X symmetry and mask out the eyes again. I just want to do a little bit more work on the angle of that brow. Take that Move brush and just shift some of the stuff around a little bit. Furrow this a little bit more, go back to our Damn Standard brush and just get a nice little wrinkle through here. I'm not too worried about symmetry this far away from the center line. I can afford to have some here. There we go. We'll come into the nose area with our Damn Standard brush and do a little bit more adjustment here just to add some visual interest. Let's get the suggestion of maybe a nasal labial fold here. Take the inflate brush, that's B, I for inflate, N. Just sort of inflate along that. We can assist ourselves by masking it, inverting the mask, and then inflating against that mask. And it really helps create that sense of a kind of puckering bit of tissue. And let's smooth that transition there up into the cheek. We'll go back to our standard brush. Let's build up the bone structure at the base of the eye socket there. Oops. Select the color white again. Go to the clay tubes brush. Hold down the Alt key. Again, just think about the planes here. It's always important also when you're sculpting just to be aware of planes and plane changes. It's just a central tenet of sculptures. Like all organic forms actually do have planes in them. They may just not be readily apparent, but your work will look far, far better if you're sensitive to the plane changes of the face. And there's lots of information about that online. If you look up planar analysis, you can find lots of modeling and sculpting tutorials that talk specifically about planar analysis of humanoid anatomy, which can be very, very helpful when you're trying to improve your sculpting. I love just as an exercise to do planar analysis of things while I'm working on it, just to make sure that everything is working correctly as it should. There we go. I'll roll around to the back of the head. And just do a little bit of work back here. Let's fill in that hollow just a little bit with the clay tubes brush. The clay tubes brush is also really nice for filling into the recesses. We'll go to the standard brush, and I'm just going to build up sort of the suggestion of the spinous processes on the spine, the little pokey out bits on the back of the spine. Let's knock those back just a little bit so they're a little bit more subtle. Alright, let's go ahead and select our damn standard brush again. Now we're down to actually sort of refining things, trying to get a little bit more detail in here. I'm going to turn off my X symmetry because I want to do some sort of wrinkles coming down into the mouth area. And we definitely don't want these to be symmetrical, so I want to just gently sketch some wrinkle patterns coming up out of the mouth up to the nose area. Let's give them a little philtrum there, sometimes called the Cupid's bow. It's a little dip in the center of the lips, and that can kind of interface with that nose shape in a real interesting way. And we'll come down here and we'll do the same thing a little bit at the lower lip. And just get a little bit of wrinkles here. And this type of asymmetry really, really does help your work. Let's turn on our X symmetry and go back to the standard brush. And I just want to hold down the Alt key and sort of push in that little hollow there. And I want to build up the tissue around this part here, sometimes called the tear duct. It's the medial canthus. I'm going to take the masking brush and mask inside of there and then invert the mask. I'm going to take the inflate brush and I'm going to inflate and smooth until I get this sort of little nub in there, the little bit inside the tear duct. That's called the medial canthus and the carnacle. So we execute Dynamesh, and you see now we're getting to a point where we don't actually have enough Dynamesh to support that level of detail. So I'll undo that. I'll go back down to Geometry, go to Dynamesh, and I'm gonna raise this. Let's raise this up to 200. Execute Dynamesh, and it will vastly increase our poly count and give us better detail. So we'll go back to our damn standard brush, sketch that in, take the standard brush, and continue to accentuate and adjust the shapes of that eyelid. I'm going to turn off X symmetry and just do some wrinkles across the neck here. I just want to do some creases, so naturally along the neckline. And then hold down the Shift key and just smooth them back. I'm always smoothing as I work. I think that's really important. Smooth as you go, and it just helps things feel a lot more natural and organic. Do a little bit of wrinkling through here. We can add even finer details using alphas, and we'll talk about that in a later chapter. The idea here is just to get you started sculpting as soon as possible. I'm going to turn on my X symmetry, and I'm just going to adjust that neck a little bit. And there we go. Now, one last thing that I think is interesting, if we select the eyeballs, and the eyeballs still have subdivision levels on them, they're not dynameshed. So if I press Control D, you can see the total polygon count here. If I hit Control D, it increases it. I can bring it up to 786,000,000. That should be good. Now I'm going to go to the standard brush, B for brush, S for standard, and I'm going to change my stroke type. Currently my stroke type is set to dots, which is pretty much the same as freehand. It takes whatever alpha I have selected and it drags it along in a stroke. What I want to do is I want to change to the drag rectangle stroke. That takes my currently selected alpha and just stamps out a single instance of it. So if I turn up my Z intensity, you'll see what that does. I'm going to change my alpha to alpha 6. I want to create a corneal bulge. That's the lens at the front of the eye. It just is a nice little added detail that helps give a sense of where the character is looking. Make sure X symmetry is turned on, and I will click and drag, and that starts to create a corneal bulge there. Step down a subdivision level with Shift D, and then we can smooth that back a little bit. And there we go. Now we've got a sense of where this character is looking because you can see the lens of the eye. There's the front of the eye. Because the eyeball isn't actually a sphere. The eyeball does have a corneal bulge on it. If I were to select the head again, just by Alt-clicking on it, which is the same as going to the subtool menu and just manually selecting the head. If I were to take the Move brush, and perhaps I wanted to bring that upper eyelid down a little bit, I would want to make sure that it deformed as if it were wrapping around that corneal bulge. So if I bring that down just a tick, like so, I would want to make sure that I get that little bump in the eyelid there to compensate for that lens which it's passing over. Let's clear the mask, go to our damn standard brush, and just make sure that we get a nice creasing and depth in that upper eyelid. And there we go. If I want to change my lighting, I can go to the light menu here and I can click this orange dot here. That's my key light. I can change the light position. And if I turn on the second light here, I can click that orange dot, drag it around. I like to increase the second light to a very high intensity and then just click once on that orange dot and it puts it behind the model. And it gives you this nice sort of rim light there. Select the key light again. We can turn this up to an intensity of 1. And there we go. So now you can see our quick sketch creature. So this chapter has really been about getting you started with ZBrush. Navigation, brush selection, tool selection, the basics of the interface. It's my hope that you can actually watch this and then go on and take a sphere and start doing some sculptures. And I think the best way to learn ZBrush is to take a break now from the videos, follow along this tutorial, do a few of these sphere sketches. I do sphere sketches all the time. It's how I test new brushes and try and learn new techniques. Don't spend a lot of time on it. Spend about an hour on it, throw it away, and do another one. The more you do, the faster you'll learn ZBrush, and the more confident you'll be with the program. Now we're going to dive in much more depth into the program in the subsequent chapters. We have a chapter where we look at the interface as a whole. We have a chapter where we talk specifically about sculpting with subdivision levels. We're going to get in and dig into every possible detail that you could imagine. So you're going to, basically be an expert user. But the place to start, the most important thing, is just to understand what it means to work from lower subdivision levels or lower polygon counts and gradually increase your resolution and increase your form as you go. So hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next chapter. Thank you. In this video, we're going to take a look at the ZBrush interface as a whole. Now, you might be tempted to skip this chapter, but I highly recommend that you take a look at this, especially if you're a brand new user to ZBrush. I consider this a demystification process where we can look at the interface, which looks not like any other program that you may have experienced, and we can demystify just how complicated it might appear on first glance. It's actually not that complex. ZBrush is a very fluid and very sensible way of interfacing with the program. You just have to understand where you go for what options. And most importantly, I think, what options that you never need to use, because there are menus here which you will never use and some that you will very rarely use. And I think by going through and seeing exactly which menu we're going to actually be using and what they do, it will help you create a basis and a sense of confidence where you can then carry on and really understand the logic behind ZBrush, because it appears to have a steep learning curve when in fact it doesn't. I've been teaching ZBrush for over a decade, and consistently I've seen that the learning curve appears very intimidating. However, it's far shorter than you think once you get past that initial hump of the interface. And once that's been demystified, you can start to problem solve and understand how to approach your models and textures. Any operation you need to do in ZBrush, you can start to work out new ways to approach it because you have a solid understanding of the interface itself. So to begin, we have a Z tool loaded up on screen in edit mode. Many of these things you'll already know from this quick start tutorial. The tool menu is on the right side, and we're going to begin by going counterclockwise and explore the entire interface. We're going to begin with the left-hand bar. This is the palettes. These are all these big buttons opening up palettes for various things that we can access inside of ZBrush. So by default, it should look something like this, standard brush with a dot stroke. The first palette here is the brush palette, and this allows you to access all of your different brushes. If I were to press the B hotkey, that brings up that brush palette wherever I happen to be on screen. Now, the next palette down is the stroke palette. The stroke palette controls how the brushes are applied to the surface. Think of this left-hand side as an artist who has her palettes in her left hand and her brush in her right. So you come over here and you can select your palette, whatever tool or alpha or stroke you want to use, and then you start to apply it to your canvas on screen. So returning to the dot stroke, if we roll around to the clean part of the model, you can see the dot stroke basically creates a freehand stroke on the model. If I were to change this to freehand, it's very, very similar. It's hard to kind of see what's happening here if we don't have a directional alpha selected. Alphas are the next palette down. Alphas allow you to access all the different grayscale images which are loaded into ZBrush, which can be used as brush tips. Alphas also serve other purposes. You can use them to make geometry, and you'll see that in a later video. But for the most part, we just use them as brush tips, very similar to Photoshop. So if I were to select Alpha 10, the star alpha, and then change or stay on the dot stroke, you see it's drawing instances of that star so close together they appear to be one continuous stroke. Now if I change my stroke to freehand, you see it's pretty much the same, but if we go to drag rectangle drags out instances of that alpha as almost like a texture stamp. So I can stamp that alpha on, just like so. If I hold down the Alt key, it subtracts. So again, the alphas simply serve as the shape of your brush, and the stroke serves as the manner in which that brush is applied to the surface. If I go to spray, I can spatter those stars all over the surface. And there's a limited number of options here under the stroke menu. I can change things like flow and placement. If I turn placement up, it increases the spread. And these settings here are also available in the top menu up here under stroke. And here you have far more options to adjust your strokes. This is true of everything in the ZBrush interface. Everything you see on screen right now is cloned from the top menus. This is sort of the core of ZBrush, this top set of menus. And everything you see down here is cloned out of those menus. I'll show you that again later, especially when we're looking at the brush controls. What's important to understand is the most commonly used options you're going to be able to access directly from the palettes. For example, import and export. You can also, if you go to the brush palette, you can load brushes and save them out. You can create, insert mesh brushes. Most of the most important operations you can access directly from the palettes. The more in-depth operations, you have to go to the menu of origin. So continuing on, we have the texture menu. Texture palette we'll talk about when we do textures. This is how we load textures into ZBrush. We can use these as textures, as reference images. We can also use them for HDR rendering. So anytime we want to bring an image into ZBrush, a color image, we will bring it into the texture palette. Now we have the material menu. In the material palette, it shows you all the different materials that are currently loaded into ZBrush that you can select. So if I change to red wax shader, it changes the material on my object. I can change to the flat color material, which strips out all the shading information and just gives me flat color. This is actually a very useful material for texture painting. So here I can select any material that I want. My personal preference is basic material 2. And the reason my ZBrush always starts with that basic material 2 is because under the material palette, I can set my startup material. So if you click that, whatever current material is selected will be the default material every time you start. The next palette down is the color palette. Here I can select color, and we're going to use that in far more depth when we do painting. We can set gradient colors by turning this on and off, and we have our 2 active color swatches, main and secondary. Again, these are only going to come into play when we're texture painting. There's a switch color button, which switches between those 2, alternate colors by Alt key, and then there's the show thumbnail button that turns that thumbnail on and off. The thumbnail view, of course, is here. If I click and drag that, I can open it and expand it. The thumbnail view is very useful. It allows you to see your character in silhouette, and that's just a fundamental of design. As we're working, not only do we want to be concerned with the internal forms and the sculpture, we want to consider how the overall silhouette or the first read appears. It's an important aspect of design, and this is very, very useful to have on screen, especially in the preliminary stages of a sculpture when you're just trying to establish your overall silhouettes and shapes. This thumbnail view allows us to always see very clearly as I'm changing the model. You see those changes update in that silhouette view, in that thumbnail view. So it's a very, very powerful, very useful design tool that I think if you have not worked with thumbnails before, you will find that this is very beneficial by getting into that mindset of always being aware not only of the internal forms, but the overall silhouette. I can click and drag to reduce that, or I can turn it off completely. Now, here we've got the navigation bust. If I click and drag that, it'll snap by degrees in rotation on all the different axes. And of course, I can use the shortcuts here to snap to view. Now we come to the right sidebar. The right sidebar is mostly navigation with a few other utilities. The top button here is BPR, that's Best Preview Render. That's the best renderer available inside of ZBrush. Of course, there's other options. You can render outside of ZBrush, and ZBrush does link directly to KeyShot, so you can use the KeyShot bridge with ZBrush to render in KeyShot. Beneath that, we have our subpix, so that's just the anti-aliasing quality. Now these buttons here are for navigating the document. So if I scroll, it moves the document around. Zoom zooms the document. Actual size makes it its actual resolution that's found here under the document window. And AA half is anti-alias half. It half sizes it and anti-aliases it. We very rarely need to use these. You don't want to navigate the document. You want to make sure you're navigating the object itself. So I leave it at actual size and then navigate around the object. Now if we're zoomed in and we want to rotate, there is this bar that goes around the perimeter of the document. If I click inside that, I can navigate by clicking there if my model fills the entire screen. Whereas if I click on the model, you're going to affect the model rather than navigate. Press the F key to refocus the model on screen. Next down we have perspective. So if I press the P key, I can turn perspective on and off. And this is just the button that does that. Now things like this, perspective, these are actually found under the draw menu. So there's the perspective button there. And if you watch as I mouse over it, it lights up out there in the interface. And that's kind of what I was talking about, that all these buttons are cloned out of these main menus at the top of the screen. So right out of the gate, ZBrush appears to have more things going on in it than it actually does. You might think that these are all separate options, but all these buttons are the most important and most commonly used tools that we're going to find in places like the brush menu, the draw menu, or the tool menu. Next we have the floor plane. The floor plane is nice to turn on if you want to get oriented around your model. We can see our axis here. There's the XYZ axis. We can also turn on the X grid and the Z grid like that. So we have 3 different grids, but typically we just have Y turned on for the floor plane. If we have the floor plane turned on when we render, we will actually cast a shadow on it. So that's something that's important to keep in mind as well. And that's only because we have the floor plane turned on. The next button down is local symmetry. Local symmetry allows symmetry to be calculated based on the center line of the model, not the origin in the world. So this is a symmetrical mesh, but if I turn off symmetry and move it off center, and then turn symmetry back on, you'll see that it's still working. If I turn off local symmetry, there we go. I had to zoom out a bit for that to work. Now you see it's no longer working. That's because local symmetry, it's determined, if local symmetry is not turned on, it's determining the center by the center of the grid. If we turn it on, it's determining the center based on the center line of the model itself. So let's return that to the origin and turn off local symmetry. This button locks the camera. This is very handy, I find, when I'm texturing, or if I'm sculpting on the edge of an object. I'll lock the camera, and now I can no longer click and drag on the background to rotate. So now I can grab the move tool and start moving the perimeter of the mesh, and it's not going to allow me to start rotating the model instead of sculpting on the edge. If I unlock the camera, then I can change my perspective again. Here we have the rotation. Basically, we're always going to be on XYZ, all axes. It just controls the axis that you're able to actually rotate around. We can confine it to Z-axis or Y-axis, but that's very rarely used. Typically, I find I'm always on XYZ. Next, we have the frame button that turns on the recentering of the object. So if I am off screen and press the F key, it will reframe and recenter the model. Here we have move, zoom, and rotate. Now these are for navigating the model. Move moves the model around, zoom zooms it in and out, and rotate rotates it. The only time I would ever use these is if I'm working with a very, very large document and it's too slow to navigate on screen. I highly recommend that you do not rely on these for navigation. Learn the navigation shortcuts, which are in the Quick Start tutorial. That is Alt, click, and drag to move, click and drag on the background to rotate, Alt, click and press down with your tablet pen, then let go of Alt and drag to zoom. Now you can also click with your Wacom button on your pen and drag to rotate, Alt, click to zoom. But it's very, very, very important, I think, to understand the navigation and not rely on those buttons, because you'll slow yourself down by going over to the side of the screen instead of just working with the navigation right there in the document window. That's just extra time, and it's not worth it. Next down, we have polyframe mode. That shows us the polygons and the polygroups. So if I have polygroups on our model, we'll see them here as color coding. I can turn off lines if I just want to see the color coding, and I can turn off color if I just want to see the polygons. Next we have transparency. Now this is for subtools. Here I have two subtools for the eyes. If I turn on transparency and ghost, I'll be able to see through those subtools, and I can see through to the eyeballs inside the mesh. Ghost is the type of transparency that's using. If I turn it off, you see it slightly alters the transparency style. Solo will isolate whatever my currently selected subtool is. Lastly, we have expose. If I click that, it will expose the various subtools. Click it again, and it brings everything back together. That can be really useful if you have a model with a whole bunch of different subtools, and maybe you're trying to find one particular part. You can spread them all out using that button. So that completes the right-hand bar. So we've seen the left-hand bar and the right-hand bar, and what all these options actually do. This is called the right-hand dock. This is where we can dock menus from the top of the screen here. Right now we have the tool menu docked. There's this little radio button here. If I click that, it actually closes that menu. If I double click the two arrows there, it closes the entire dock and gives me more workspace. Double click those again, and it opens the dock. And if I come back up here and click that radial button on any of these menus, I can click or drag that and it will place it on the right-hand side. Or I can click and drag and manually dock like that. If I double click the name of the menu, it will collapse. If I click the little radio button again, it removes the menu entirely. Now there is a right side dock and there is a left hand dock. If I double click here, you see there's an entire different one. So oftentimes I may have two different menus open. Perhaps I'll put the brush menu on the left hand side by clicking and dragging, and that menu is now docked on the left hand side. I can collapse it, and then again, regain more screen real estate. So the right hand dock is where we're going to have our currently active menu that we're going to the most often. Now moving up to the upper portion of the screen here, the top bar, here we have the home page. Here with the light box. Now the light box is typically open by default when you load ZBrush. The light box is just a file browser. It allows you to bring in any type of file that you can save out of ZBrush. That includes brushes, textures, Z-tools. Sometimes it takes a little time for those to load. Projects. Here we have a variety of different projects that we can access inside of ZBrush. We have our most recent files here. We have materials. Now these materials are different, and these tools are different, and these brushes are different than the ones we find in the palettes. These are not currently loaded into ZBrush. The Lightbox is a file browser. It basically looks in the ZBrush install folder and allows you to load in files from there. So inside the ZBrush load folder, you're going to find a variety of brushes which are not loaded by default. And they may just be variations or specialty brushes that you don't necessarily want to have all the time. So I can go in here and I can grab some variation of the layer brush, for example, or I can go to the planar brushes and I'll find some variations in the planar brushes. If I want to load a brush from here, I simply select it, double click it, and it loads it into ZBrush. And that is now in the brush palette. Were I to restart ZBrush, this brush would no longer be loaded because ZBrush only loads those brushes which are set to load by default. The ones in the light box are simply there so we can access them as we want them and load them then. Here we have alphas, materials. We have various noises for the noise maker, fibers for fiber mesh, arrays, various grids. We have render sets for non-photorealistic rendering. We have various filters, which we can access here for NPR rendering, non-photorealistic rendering. We have our quick save. Now, quick save happens while you're working in ZBrush. It will automatically save your work. You can also manually quick save by clicking this button here, and it will create a new quick save, an incremented quick save file in the quick save folder. And if I want to manually open a file, I just click Open File and I can open it there. Next, we have Live Boolean. Live Boolean we'll talk about in more depth in the Boolean chapter, but this is typically used for hard surface, but it does have other uses as well. It simply turns on Live Boolean so it functions. Now here we have the most important aspect of the top menu. We have Edit Mode. Now when we load a model into ZBrush, you know that we press the T key to go into edit mode. That's very, very important. If we don't do that, then we're just going to keep drawing the model on the screen. I'll show you what I mean by that. I'm going to exit out of edit mode and clear the canvas. Now I'm going to start drawing a model on the canvas. I've got my bust loaded up here. If I click and drag, it draws it on screen, but I don't enter edit mode and I just keep clicking and dragging. It just draws instance after instance on screen. That's because the ZBrush canvas, the window we're sculpting in, is a 2.5D illustration panel. This was used many, many years ago for illustration in ZBrush, and that's why we're able to drop models onto it. If you have a situation like this where you have something stuck on your screen, press Ctrl N for new and that clears the canvas. Draw the model on screen, press the T key, which is just like pressing the edit button here. Any button here in ZBrush that has a hotkey will give you the hotkey in the tooltip. So there's T for edit. Now immediately we go into perspective, my cursor turns red, and I'm able to sculpt. Here we have draw. Draw just means that we're in sculpt mode. That's different from move, scale, and rotate, which brings up the gizmo here, which allows us to move, scale, and rotate the object itself. So if I turn off X symmetry, you can see that we can scale this, we can rotate it, and we can move. The hotkeys for there are W, E, and R. Now, I'm using the gizmo for this, but if I turn the gizmo button off, this turns into a transpose line. We talk about transpose in the transpose chapter, but it's important to know that if you want to access the transpose line, simply turn off gizmo and that will bring it up. Next, we have Sculptris Pro Mode. Sculptris Pro Mode is just a method of sculpting that tessellates your mesh as you're sculpting. We have a chapter specifically dedicated to that as well. It's something that we may not use often, but it's very important to know how to use it. So going back to Draw, you can see that we have all these brush controls here. These are all coming from the multiple places. First off, these first menu buttons here are coming from the Transform menu. Draw, Move, Scale, and Rotate. You see they light up in the interface. Again, these are just clones of things that come out of the top menu bar. If I go to I go to the Draw menu, you can see that we have our draw size, focal shift, Z intensity. All these sliders are just cloned out of the main menu. So basically, everything you see up here is just making it easier on you so you don't have to go seek things out in the interface depths. You can just find them on screen where you need them. We have the ability to paint with an alpha. We can turn that on and off. Here we have mRGB, RGB, and M, Z-add and Z-sub. This is what controls what our brush is doing. My brush right now, I'm going to change to the standard brush, reset it to its original settings. By default, I have it set to paint with alpha and it's set to Z-add. If I set it to Z-sub, this is what happens. As I stroke on the model, it subtracts. Now, I never change any of my brushes to Z-sub or Z-add because if you press the Alt key, it will always do the opposite of its default setting. So I find it easier to leave the brush as it is and hold Alt when I want to subtract. Now, as I'm painting, or as I'm sculpting, if I turn on M, it will not only sculpt, but it'll also add material. So let's fill this with material. I've got the gray shade material on, so I will go to Color, Fill Object. And because I have M turned on, it will fill the material channel. So if I change my material now, we won't see it change on the model because I filled the material channel with the gray material. But I have material turned on my brush and I have a new material selected. So as I'm sculpting, ZBrush paints material as well as sculpting. Now if I turn on RGB, ZBrush will paint as I sculpt. If I turn off sculpt, it will just paint. We'll see that in more detail in our painting video. What I'll do is I will turn on RGB, go to Color, Fill Object. That fills the object, the RGB channel, with that color white. So now if I change to a different color and start sculpting, you can see that it's adding color along with the sculpting strokes. Lastly, we have mRGB. That adds color and material at the same time. So it's adding both the wax shader and the blue color. Typically, we leave our brushes at their default settings unless we're going in for painting. If we have RGB turned on, you'll notice that we can control the RGB intensity with this slider. With Z-add, we have the Z intensity slider. This controls the relative strength of the brush. If I turn it all the way up, it's very strong. If I turn it quite low, it's very, very weak. Let's get it a little bit, there we go. Next we have Remember Draw Size per Brush. If we turn this on, if I set my draw size for my standard brush to be about so, that's my standard brush draw size. But then I change the inflate brush, you see it's changed the draw size. Go back to standard, it's remembered its draw size. Go to inflate, maybe I'll make the inflate really tiny. Go to standard, go back to inflate. So all of my brushes will remember their individual draw sizes with that button turned on. Focal shift and draw size. Draw size is the overall size of the brush. Focal shift changes that inner circle. That's the fall off of the brush, the fall off of the alpha actually. So we adjust that like so. Now here we lastly have active points and total points. This is very useful for understanding how dense the model currently is. Now these sliders up here are really useful, but I don't recommend trying to access them there. As I'm sculpting, I always press the spacebar. The spacebar brings up this quick menu which gives me access to my draw size, focal shift, Z intensity, and all those other options. Now you could also press things like the S key for just draw size, or if you go to Z intensity, that's the U hotkey. Press the U key, that brings up your Z intensity. So it's up to you what you find to be the most comfortable to use. Personally, I prefer to use the spacebar, but you could also use those individual hotkeys. And as you mouse over the sliders, it will tell you what those hotkeys are. So those are the left and right sidebar, the docks, and the top bar menu. So already you're seeing that these are the most commonly used bits and pieces inside of the interface. Now let's take a look at the top menu and see what we're actually going to use at its core. The alpha menu we will use. We use this menu to adjust the grayscale images that we bring into ZBrush. Maybe we want to turn them into brushes, maybe we want to turn them into geometry. This is the menu that's used with some regularity. The brush menu is used to hack your brushes. You get into all the nitty-gritty settings of your brushes, like auto masking, and you can adjust the various types of controls like backface masking. Turn on backface masking, and that protects the backside of thin meshes. Cavity masking will mask the recesses of a model from our stroke. We can also do topological masking. These are all things that we talk about in the brush chapter. The color menu, really we don't come into this very often because it's just the color palette with a few other options like system palette and fill object. So it's pretty self-explanatory and not a very complicated menu. The document menu you won't find yourself using very often because a very common mistake for new ZBrush users is to save a document instead of a Z tool. So you always want to save your tool by going to Tool, Save As, or go to File, Save As, and that will save as a project. File, Save As is a project. The Draw menu gives you many more options for things like the camera and the grids. We do use this menu, especially when we want to access our camera settings. It's basically just a way to give you further and deeper controls over the grids, the cameras, and some brush options here. We don't use it a lot, but we do use it. The edit menu is not quite so important. It's mainly just Control Z, your undos, and you can, of course, also trim your undo history here. You can use delete older undo history here, so you can delete your previous undos. The file menu here, this is something that we use, but we don't go to it often because Control S is the hotkey that accesses the most important menu option there, which is File, Save As. Now here's where it gets interesting. The layer menu we don't use. This is a legacy menu. This is for 2.5D illustration layers. Now ZBrush does paint and sculpt in layers, but you do not use the layer menu for this. For this, we go to the Tool menu and open Layers here. And this is where we do our painting and sculpting layers under the Tool menu. So don't get confused and use this layer menu here because that does not work with our 3D models. The Light menu is just for adjusting our lighting. So we will come in here, especially when we're doing renders or movies. It's pretty self-explanatory. We do light caps and we can adjust some shadow settings in here, but it's mainly about adjusting and placing lighting within our scene. The macro menu allows you to record a series of actions inside of ZBrush and then play them back, much like you might do in Microsoft Word. This is essentially a way of Z-scripting without having to code. Now here we have the marker menu. This is another menu that's defunct. We don't use this menu anymore. The multi-markers predate subtools, and it used to be a way of locking two different tools together, but it's not something that we have to use anymore, so we really never touch this menu. The material menu is where we go to control our material settings. So if I open the basic material, which is the startup material, so we'll select that again. Now if I go to the material menu and open up modifiers, I can change things like the specular. I can turn that up. Maybe I want to adjust the specular curve. Make sure we're on the basic material too. There we go. Now you can see that will respond to the changes. So as I change the sliders and adjust the curve, it will change the specular component of that material. The movie palette, we will use this when we want to do our timeline for animation or to store model positions. We also do turntables in here and different types of movies that we can render out of ZBrush. We have a chapter dedicated to this, so I encourage you to watch that to learn how to render your own turntables and animations in ZBrush. The picker palette is generally used when we're hacking the nitty-gritty of a brush. This is a very advanced customized brush setting. It just controls how the brush interacts with the surface as you stroke along it. If the brush orients once when you first click, or if it continually reorients as you draw along the surface. It's all quite advanced and not something that most people ever access, even advanced power users. It's mainly about hacking brushes and creating very, very specific types of custom brushes. The preference menu is like any other preferences menu. This is where we go to change our preferences for the various aspects of the interface. Most importantly, I think we have our import-export preferences here. Transpose units are very useful. We have all our different options here for exporting from ZBrush. And again, this is a very important menu, but it is rather self-explanatory. It's like you find in any other program. Next, we have the render menu. The render menu allows us to control our render settings. So remember when we did our BPR render, I'm going to adjust my specular again. I don't want it to be so plastic looking. So if I do a BPR render, you'll notice the shadows are very hard. Let's change that eyeball color back to white. If we go into our render menu, we can control things like BPR shadow. If I change the angle slider, I can soften the shadow edge. So if I render once again, after making that change, you see I have control over the softness of the edge of the shadows. And we'll talk about this in more depth in a later chapter, but I just wanted you to understand why we go here. The stencil menu isn't quite used so much anymore. Alphas can be turned into stencils, which we can use for painting, just like you would spray paint through a cardboard stencil. Typically, this has been supplanted by Spotlight and the Spotlight tools, so it's very rare that we actually use the stencil menu anymore. The stroke menu, we've already seen, it just gives us further and deeper control over the stroke palette. We can control Lazy Mouse, we can control Sculptris Pro. So we will use this menu with some regularity. The texture menu allows us to control the textures that we've brought into ZBrush. If you want to change their orientation or add them to Spotlight, this is where we'll do that. And again, we'll talk about this in more depth in our texturing chapters. Of course, the tool menu. The tool menu is the workhorse menu of ZBrush. This is the main menu that you're going to spend most of your time in when you're working on a Z tool. This allows you to access your subtools, your layers. If you want to change your geometry settings, you can do that here. If you want to access your fiber mesh settings, surface noise, all these different things, anything that applies directly to this Z tool, you will find under the tool menu. Now we have the transform menu, which everything that is really important in here, you're already going to find docked outside in the main interface where we've already seen it. The majority of what's important is already docked outside, so we come here often except maybe to access our symmetry controls. That's the X key for activate symmetry, but here we can change the symmetry axis and we can turn on radial symmetry as well as posable symmetry, all things that we will talk about later. So the transform menu is useful, but it's not one that you find yourself using an awful lot. Lastly, we have the Z plugin menu. Z plugin allows you to access all the plugins for ZBrush. This includes the ones that are loaded by default, as well as plugins that you've loaded independently. If you check out ZBrush Central, you'll find many plugins there as well. And that's the last menu we actually use. The next is ZScript. Now, unless you're actually doing ZScripting, you won't use that. And the help menu, we really don't use very often, but you can see that this is where you can access things like ZBrush Central, the online documentation, and the Pixologic support room. ZBrush Live, it's nice to go on there, and I have a couple videos on there if you want to go watch artists working live or pre-recordings of artists working live. Now at the very, very top, we have our version, our file, our free memory, our active memory, scratch disk space. We also have our polygon count, and as you've already seen, our quick save button. We can also adjust our transparency of the interface as a whole by adjusting that slider. And we can reset our interface by moving between the interface colors and the interface itself using these buttons here. And that is the ZBrush interface. That has hopefully demystified it for you. I hope this helps clarify how many things you're actually going to use and how many things you're not going to use within the program. And I hope it makes it feel less imposing. So you've already done the quick start tutorial, so you really have a solid basis of the most important aspects of ZBrush. But as you step back and look at the interface as a whole, I hope it helps you see how everything you see on screen around the perimeter It's just there to simplify and speed up your workflow because it all comes out of those top menus there. It just makes your life easier so you don't have to keep going back and forth. So that concludes this video. I hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. Now we're going to take a look at cameras in ZBrush. We're going to access the cameras under the Draw menu here. I'm going to click the little radial icon and just dock this menu on the right-hand side of the screen. And about halfway down, you'll see this camera icon here. And these are the controls for our camera. Now, you already know if you press the P key for perspective, that will turn perspective on and off. The button is also here. Now, here we have a universal perspective camera. This is a new perspective camera that was introduced in ZBrush 2019. This is far more accurate than the previous perspective that was in ZBrush. You'll find that it lines up exactly with the cameras that you'll have in Maya or 3D Studio Max. We can actually even import cameras that we export from external applications into ZBrush. We'll talk about that in just a moment. So if I rotate around the model, and then I can change my horizontal or vertical computation. Most of these settings will be familiar to anybody who does a lot of maybe photography with a DSLR. Typically, we're going to keep it at horizontal. The most important settings are going to be here. This is our focal length. Now, you can adjust the focal length via this slider here, and that will change the distortion that's created by the perspective. You could also elect to adjust it in terms of its field of view. Typically, I stick with the buttons here, 35, 50, and 85. 50 millimeters, the natural lens length, the normal lens length for a 35 millimeter camera. So this most closely approximates the human eye. Sometimes I'll turn it up to 85 if I just feel like the 50 millimeter lens doesn't quite give me the look that I want. I'll go up to 85. You can turn this up very high, which becomes a telephoto lens, and you'll notice that that completely flattens any sort of perspective distortion. If I turn my focal length down, then we start to get into fisheye lens, very wide angle territory. And this can actually be quite beneficial if we're trying to create a very dynamic image. For example, this character, if I was going to render this to paint outside of ZBrush, I might render it actually with this very low focal length because it gives me that wide angle distortion and a very dynamic, dramatic look. Here you've got undos for the camera. Now this is really nice. We can actually undo back through all the changes that we made to our camera. That's new in ZBrush, and that's actually really quite a nice tool to have. And I don't know how many times I've moved a camera and regretted it. Typically, I'll store keyframes on the camera under the movie timeline. So if you go to Movie Timeline Show, previous to this, I would just simply store keyframes for my cameras like this. Now, if I use my left and right arrow keys, I can move back between those stored camera views. This, however, just allows me to undo camera changes right there with the press of a button. Now, here we have a lock button. This lock button is also available here. This locks the camera, and I find this really nice, especially when I'm sculpting with an image plane in the background. This keeps you from being able to move the camera. So I can sculpt and work in ZBrush. If I go to my Move brush, I can do all sorts of sculpting in here. But I'm not going to actually be able to move the model if I click and drag on the background. So locking the camera is actually quite a helpful thing to have access to. Now, if we scroll down, you'll notice that there is a camera settings box down here. We have Select Camera, Store Camera, Rename, Delete, and All. Now, this is for custom cameras. So, for example, if I want to store this particular camera, I'll click Store Camera, and we'll call it Wide Angle Render. So I've now stored that camera. If I were to change to a different setting, maybe we'll go to 85 millimeter, go to the front and look slightly up at the creature. I'll store this camera, and I'll call this camera telephoto. Well, not telephoto, we'll just call this front view. So I now have two cameras stored. If I click on the camera names, you see I have wide angle render and I have front view. These two cameras are available. If I go back to wide angle render, it will return me to that camera. If I go to front view, it will return me to that camera. I can rename the camera here with the rename button. I can delete the selected camera, or if I click all, it will delete all the cameras. So being able to have this level of control over my cameras in ZBrush is very, very nice, and having a more accurate perspective camera is invaluable. One thing that is really quite cool is you can actually import FBX files that have been saved outside of ZBrush. Now, an FBX file is a portable 3D file format that will allow you to save cameras and geometry out of, for example, Maya, and then bring that into ZBrush. So you can import cameras from Maya to ZBrush. So let's take a look at how to do that now. Now here we are in Maya, and you can see I've got 3 cameras that have been set up. If I go to Panels, Perspective, and I can look through each one. This is Maya Camera 1. Maya Camera 2 is a top view. And then Maya Camera 3 is a front view, very wide angle. So what I want to do is I want to export these cameras as an FBX file. So I will just Control-click on each one of these, and I will go to File, Export Selection. Make sure that we're set to FBX Export, and I'm just going to save them as Maya cameras. Now I'm going to move back over to ZBrush. Now here in ZBrush, to import an FBX file, we need to go to the Z plugin menu. We'll dock this over on the side of the screen and go to FBX Export Import. Now, I can export FBX files from ZBrush. Here I've got selected. I can change that to visible or to all in terms of what will actually be exported. I can set my type here. I have it set to FBX 2019. If you click on this, you can actually change by going through all the different options here. I'm just going to have to scroll back to 2019 just by clicking, and there we go. Now I can save as a binary or ASCII file. Typically I leave it at binary. Just like STL files, there's 2 different options, binary or ASCII. ASCII will be larger, binary will be smaller in terms of file size. We also have the option to export 3D layers as blend shapes. We have the option to export our quads as tris, and we can set our Y up. In this case, it is Maya Y up. We can embed the maps, and we can smooth the normals. Now, we also have the option to export our diffuse and normal maps as TGA or 16-bit TIFF, and there's our export button. Now, what we're interested in here is the import. So if I go to the options, here I'm going to set import cameras, and I'm going to click the import button and then just browse to the Maya export file. Here we have the file has been imported, no meshes, but 3 cameras have been imported. And there we go. It snaps right to our first camera. So if I go to Draw, let's dock this on the right-hand side of the screen and scroll down to the bottom, back here under our cameras settings, you see there's Maya Camera 3. If I use these arrow keys, I can scroll through those 3 cameras that I made. There's Maya Camera 1, Maya Camera 2, Maya Camera 3. So I can sequentially move through each one of those cameras, and you see that it has actually maintained the focal length and the camera position exactly as it was in Maya. So there is a seamless transition between Maya and ZBrush or 3D Studio Max or any other 3D application that will export FBX files and ZBrush when it comes to sharing your cameras, and that is profoundly helpful. I find myself using this tool to work on top of image planes that I may be using in Maya. I find it very, very useful for shot sculpt fixes if I'm trying to fix a few frames of animation by just directly sculpting over the deformed meshes. I find it very, very helpful to be able to export my camera from Maya and do that sculpting in ZBrush and then export back to Maya. So having that type of communication between ZBrush and Maya and that consistency of cameras is so, so helpful. So that completes this look at ZBrush cameras. I hope you found this video helpful, and I will see you in the next lesson. Thanks for watching. In this video, we're going to take a look at folders and how to organize subtools using folders in ZBrush. So here you can see, under the tool menu, we have our subtool menu. The first thing you'll notice, there's a visible count. We can change the visible count of subtools by turning the slider up and down. So right now I've got it set to about 8 or 9. There's, that's enough to show the subtools that we have visible right now. Now, in the subtool palette, I have the bust itself, I have the teeth, the eyes, I have the base, I have a Boolean here, if you see I have live Boolean turned on, if I turn that off, that's just a Boolean object that's subtracting, scalloping out this area for the nameplate. And then I have the orc's name here. And that, if I go into frame mode, you'll see is also a Boolean subtract object. So if I turn off frame mode and just turn off live Boolean, and let's turn off visibility on this one, and solo this, you can see those are the letters, and those are just being subtracted from the base. Now I'll turn live Boolean back on so everything looks as it should. Now what we want to do is we want to organize these subtools with folders. I want to organize the bust itself, that is the torso, the eyes, and the teeth, into one folder, and then I want to put the base with the Boolean objects into a second folder. So to do that, I'll select the bust, and I'll click New Folder. And this asks for a folder name. We'll just call it Bust. And automatically it puts that torso inside that folder. Now I want to move the teeth and eyes in there, so I'm just going to click this tool, select it, and then drag. And you see I get this blue arrow, and that tells me where in the hierarchy it's going to go. So I'm just going to place it right there, and it sits inside the bust folder now. And we'll do the same thing for the eyes. Select them, and then click and drag to place them inside the hierarchy. If I click the folder, it will collapse, and now I can actually change visibility on that whole folder, and it will either show and hide the objects inside of it. So now we'll do the same thing for the base. I'll select the first subtool here, the base, and I will click New Folder and call it Base. We'll select the subtraction object and place that inside that folder, and we'll grab the nameplate and place that inside the folder. Now sometimes when you move subtools around, you might have a slight delay on the Boolean displaying. If you just deselect and select the subtool again, it should refresh the Boolean, or turn live Boolean on and off, and that will refresh it. So we'll collapse that folder. So now I have two folders for this Z tool. Within these folders are 3 subtools. You see the orange 3 there that tells me how many objects are inside there. Now let's take a look at what folders allow us to do. If I select the bust folder here and then click the gear icon, you can see there's a whole myriad of different operations that we can perform here. If I click transpose set, that will take the bust and it will put it into a transpose set, so I can move all those subtools together. That includes the teeth and the eyes. I can also do transpose add. That will add to that transpose set. So if I click transpose add on the base, I've now added the base and the head. If I do on the gear icon on the base here, if I do transpose sub, it will remove that from my transpose set. So that's the same as just selecting the pizza boxes here on the transpose gizmo, so we can add various subtools to the transpose set. Now if I go back to my gear, you'll see that I've got duplicate. If I click duplicate, it'll say that it asks me if I want to duplicate the folder and the subtools. I click OK, and you see it has now duplicated the bust folder. If I select that duplicate bust folder, I can click delete folder or delete all. If I delete the folder, it will just delete the folder itself, and that leaves the subtools. However, if I delete all, it will delete the folder and its contents. So I'm just going to come in here now and delete these individual subtools. There we go. Now if I click the gear again, you see that we have merge up. What that'll do is it'll merge the folder with the folder above it. So if I wanted to merge the base with the bust, I would select the base folder and then click merge up, and that would merge those together. If we go to the bust, I can show and hide polypaint. So if I click hide polypaint, that turns polypaint off for that. If I click show polypaint, it will show the polypaint. Now we have Boolean folder and Boolean with dynamic subdivision levels. Now Booleans, sometimes we use start groups for those. And if you watch our chapter on Booleans, you'll understand what start groups are. Folders allow us to do similar things that start groups, but give us a little bit more flexibility. So the base, for example, this has Boolean objects in it. So if I select that and then I click Boolean folder, what it will do is it will create a new Boolean object based on the Boolean objects inside that folder. So if you watch, it's remeshing right now. And in just a moment, we will have a new tool that represents the Booleans. So you see, here's my processing there, and there we go. There's our UMesh polymesh. So if I select that and solo it, you can see there is our base with the Booleans applied. It's no longer a collection of subtools, it's actually a single subtool with the booleans applied to it. So let's go ahead and delete that object and go back to our Boolean folder and turn on visibility and turn off solo. Now, Boolean with d-subdiv, that's just Booleans using dynamic subdivision levels. So if you watch a Boolean chapter, you'll understand what dynamic subdivision levels are. Just to quickly recap, under geometry, dynamic subdivision levels are here. These are simply a way of smoothing a mesh without adding subdivision levels. We use them often in ZModeler and in Booleans. It allows you to use things like insert mesh brushes, which do not work on meshes that have multiple subdivision levels, but it allows us to have a smooth mesh and then apply brushes like that to such a mesh. So if you are using dynamic subdivision levels, this operation will execute the Boolean and execute it using the dynamic subdivision levels. Now we can rename the folder here and merge the folder. So if I click Merge Folder, you can see now it's created a new subtool, which is the merge of all those objects. Now for the base, that's not particularly useful because these are made up of Boolean objects. But if we go back to the bust, we can merge this. If I click Merge Folder, it will merge all of those tools into a new object here. There we go. There is the creature with the eyes and the teeth merged into a single subtool. So this is just a method of cleaning up things. If you've got a whole bunch of subtools that you just want to merge into one, you can do that using the merge operator. Let's delete that subtool and turn off solo. So folders are very, very useful the more subtools that you get, because it's very easy to have, several subtools clogging up this menu. And if you organize them using folders, it'll make it a lot easier to navigate your characters, navigate costume elements, maybe navigate bases or environment elements. And it's a very useful way to not only keep your scene organized, but also streamline these types of operations, especially transpose sets and Booleans. I use those two operations the most often whenever I'm working with folders in ZBrush. So let's go ahead and turn that Boolean back on. There we go. Let's turn on visibility on our base here. And there we go. So that is folders in ZBrush. Hopefully you found this useful and you can start to take this video, take the information from this video and start to utilize folders in your own workflow and see how powerful and how effective it can be for keeping your work organized and making it a lot easier to navigate your Z-tools. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. In this chapter, we're going to talk about creating hotkeys in ZBrush. Now, if you've done the Quick Start tutorial, you saw that we were selecting brushes manually by going to the Brush menu with the B hotkey, and then narrowing it down using the contextual hotkeys. Now, this is an awful lot of keystrokes to get to something that can be simplified down to a single keystroke. The Brush menu is huge, and I always hotkey my favorite brushes. There's about 5 brushes that I use consistently, and I have those hotkeyed to the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. As I press the numbers, you'll see the palette change here. Number 1 is Move, watch here. 2 is Standard Brush. 3 is the Inflate Brush. 4 is Clay Tubes. And number 5 is the Damn Standard Brush. Now, anything in ZBrush can be hotkeyed by simply pressing Control, Alt, and then clicking on that interface item. So for example, if I wanted to hotkey, say, if I go to Geometry, if I want to hotkey SUV, Smooth UV, if I Control Alt click on that button, at the top of the screen you see it press any key combination to assign a custom hotkey. That's all you have to do. Any button you press now will be assigned as a hotkey to that button item. So we're going to set 5 hotkeys for the best go-to brushes in my opinion. As you continue working with ZBrush, your core selection of brushes may change, and that's fine, but I think it's very important as we're sculpting to be able to just press numerical keys and immediately have your brushes on hand. So to do this, I'm going to open up the brush menu, and I'm going to click the little radial icon here to dock it on the side of the screen. We'll click and drag it. There we go. Now we have our brush menu. Now we do not want to hotkey this icon here. That is the brush palette. But all the smaller ones, these are actually brushes that have been selected recently. Those are icons for brushes themselves. So if we're trying to hotkey a brush, and you don't have it listed there, simply select the brush. For example, snake hook. It's not on this list right now, but if I go to B for brush, S for snake hook, and then select the snake hook brush, now that appears in this list. So these buttons represent the actual brushes themselves. So we'll begin with the move brush. Control-Alt-Click on the move brush icon, and then just press the number 1. At the top of the screen, you see that it has successfully assigned the hotkey. Number 2, we're going to set to the standard brush. So we're going over to standard and Control-Alt-Click on it and press the number 2. Number 3 will assign to the inflate brush. Control-Alt-Click and press the number 3. Number 4, we'll make clay tubes. Once again, make sure you use clay tubes and not clay buildup. Control-Alt-Click and make that number 4. And the dam standard is number 5. Now that I've set these hotkeys, I need to save them. So they load up every time I load ZBrush. To do that, go to the Preferences menu, go to Hotkeys, and then simply click Store. That will save the hotkeys in a hotkey file in your startup folder in ZBrush. So every time you start, it will always have your hotkeys set. You can also take your Z startup folder and move it to different workstations if you want to transfer your personal settings and your hotkeys between machines. I keep my interface pretty standard because I move around and work on different people's machines, and I do a lot of teaching, so I like to have a standardized interface so I always know exactly where to go to find what I need. I also find that it's easier to just customize the hotkeys for me than to customize the interface itself. I cluster my hotkeys around numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and the Alt key modifier. My thumb is generally on the Alt key anyway to create subtractive mode on my brushes. So I can always access the draw size and the Z intensity with the spacebar, and then use the Alt key to access my hotkeys. Now, I think it's very important to start using hotkeys early on in your ZBrush learning experience so you don't find yourself wasting a lot of time navigating the brush menu, and you're able to really just think about focusing on sculpting and the forms you're creating. You don't want to have to put a lot of thought into selecting brushes. You just want to be able to pick up the brush that you want, just like you're sitting at a sculpting table or painting. Now, you don't have to only hotkey brushes. You can also hotkey entire menus. Let's say, for example, I want to hotkey the tool menu itself. If I Control-Alt-Click on the tool menu, again it asks me to assign a custom hotkey, I'll set that to Alt-2. Now when I press Alt-2, it brings up the tool menu wherever I happen to be on screen. And this can actually be quite handy as well. We have a chapter where we talk just about customizing the interface, where you can take your favorite items out of any menu and create a custom menu, and then hotkey that menu. So in your custom menu, you can have all your favorite interface options that you like to use, and then you hotkey that so you can pull up this custom sort of marking menu wherever you happen to be on screen. So if you want to pursue that chapter on interface customization, I do recommend taking a look at that. So that concludes our look at hotkeys, and I hope that you take advantage of this customization procedure and you can hack your ZBrush and make it as speedy and efficient as possible by taking full advantage of hotkeys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.
Move individual subtools or subtools as a whole. In that case, we'll press either the W, E, or R key, and that brings up the gizmo you see here. And that should be relatively straightforward compared to any other transpose or gizmo that you've seen in other 3D applications. Currently, I'm going to untick that stack of boxes there. Your gizmo should look like this. If I click and drag in any of these axes, it will move that selected subtool. So I'm moving the body separate from the floor plane, the teeth, and the tongue. If I click and drag in this outer circle, I'll rotate around the visible axis. And if I click and drag in these circles here, I'll rotate around the X, Y, and Z axis. If I hold down the Shift key while I rotate, it will give me a little readout just down there. You see it next to the arm. That tells me the number of degrees that are being rotated. Now, if I want to move the pivot, hold down the Alt key and just click and drag in any of those white corners, and you can move that pivot. Now, let's say I want to move all the subtools, not just the currently selected subtool. That can be accomplished as well. Simply clicking this button here creates what's called the pizza box stack. This tells us that we are moving all the selected subtools. So now if I click and drag, you see everything is moving. The same goes for rotate and for scale. Now if I Control-Shift-Click on anything here in the view in terms of the subtools, I can remove or add elements to that transpose group. So Control-Shift-Click on the body, the teeth, and the tongue. You see the floor plane is no longer part of the transpose group, so I'm not moving the floor plane, I'm only moving the character and his teeth and tongue. Now, if you find yourself in a situation like this, where, let's say, for example, your gizmo is not actually sitting in the correct position, looking down each axis, unlock it by clicking the unlock button, reset it by clicking the reset button, and then turn off your X symmetry, and then hit this button here. Go to Unmasked Mesh Center. Oops. And that will recenter that gizmo right on the correct axis. Now lock it again, and you're able to use it for moving, scaling, and rotation. Now there's also an ability to pin the pivot here. So if you turn on sticky mode, that will be sticky. So if I try and move the pivot, it snaps back to its original location. And then there's the gear here, which allows us to access the primitives and deformers. We talk about the primitives and deformers in a separate video on transpose primitives and deformers. So in this video, we're mainly focusing on transpose posing. So now we've seen how we use the transpose gizmo to move, scale, and rotate individual subtools or groups of subtools. Now let's take a look at the transpose line, which is the other method of moving subtools in ZBrush. The transpose line actually predates the gizmo by several ZBrush versions. So we access it just by turning off the gizmo button here. Now if I click and drag, you see I've got this orange line with 3 orange circles. This is the transpose line. The transpose line is another method of moving and scaling and rotating subtools. So if I were to go to Move, click inside this center orange circle, I can move this subtool. If I wanted to scale it, I would click and drag to create a new transpose line. Go to E for scale and click inside the outermost circle and drag, and I will rotate or scale around this pivot here, which is the first circle. If I go to rotate, again, this will be my center of rotation. Click and drag in this outermost circle and it will rotate the character. Now, if I want to move, press the W key, click inside the center circle, and that moves. Now, we're only moving an individual subtool. We're not moving them all. To move all the subtools, we have to go to Z Plugin and use Transpose Master. Now, this is a plugin we'll be talking about shortly. So transpose can be a little bit tricky because oftentimes you'll end up with something like this where your line is sort of stacked up in a way you can't see. So I just always draw a new line every time I want to use it, just by clicking somewhere on the model, dragging off onto the background, so that creates a straight line. And then I click on any of the circles and I can move the transpose line and place it exactly where I want it. If I click on this circle, I can move this and I can position that transpose line so it lays exactly where I want it to be. So let's check this with the tongue subtool. If I select the tongue subtool, we'll solo it and I'll focus in on it. Now if I click here and drag, I'm creating a new transpose line. If I go to R for rotate, clicking the outermost circle, I can rotate around this pivot here. Go to E for scale, I can scale around that pivot. Now watch this. If I take my transpose line, click on the outermost circle and just stretch it down and move it so it's running sort of along the axis, the center line of this tongue. And I go to R for rotate. Usually when we rotate, we use the outermost circle. But I'm going to hold down the Alt key and I am going to click and drag inside the center circle. And this will twist that object along its Z-axis. Look at that. So we get a nice sort of twist to the tongue there. If I want to go to move, instead of clicking in the center circle, I'll click in the outer circle. I can skew and scale or stretch, I should say, this object. And if I want to change the position of my tool, or my gizmo line, transpose line, click on a circle to move it. Click on a circle and to move it. Click on the center circle and you move the entire line. So that is transpose gizmo, or transpose line, to move individual subtools. It is separate from the gizmo. Again, you access it by turning the gizmo on and off. So if I'm in move mode here and I press the gizmo line button again, I get the gizmo back. If I turn it off, I get my transpose line. Now, a good tip, whenever I'm using transpose, I just always draw a new transpose line every time I want to use it. So let's take a look now at probably the most important aspect of transpose, and that is posing. We can use the transpose line to pose our characters and give them character and posture and make them interact with their environments and each other. So let's take a look now at how to do that. Now let's take a look at posing. For this creature, I'm going to start posing the character using the transpose line. So I'm going to select the body and I'm going to step down to the lowest subdivision level. I'm going to press W for move and then turn off the gizmo so I'm on the transpose line. Now, the transpose line generally moves the entire object. However, if you mask part of it, and I'm going to mask the torso by holding down the control key, clicking and dragging, and this does something called transpose masking. It masks based on the underlying topology. I'm just going to mask down to the waist here. Again, that's just hold down the control key and click and drag along the model. And you see as I drag out that transpose line, the model is masked based on the underlying topology. I'll go back into draw mode, hold down the control key. Let's turn off the floor plane so we can see better. And then I can just manually add into the mask using control, click and drag. Now I'll control click on the background to invert that mask, and then control click on the mask itself to feather the edge. Now I'll go to R for rotate, and I'll click about here at the pelvis and drag a new transpose line out. I'm going to go to the top view and turn off perspective mode, and I'm just going to click and drag on the center circle and move that transpose line down the center of the spine and just turn off X symmetry. Now if I go to rotate, R for rotate, and then click in the outermost circle and drag, you see I'm moving the unmasked portion of the mesh. And if I move the transpose line, I can change that center of rotation. It will always be around the opposite circle. You may also notice that the teeth and the tongue are not moving. That's because those are subtools. To move those, we have to use Transpose Master. It's a plugin that's found in the Z plugin menu that will put all the subtools together into one temporary mesh, which can be posed together, and then it'll transfer that pose back to the individual subtools. To do that, we go to Z plugin, open Transpose Master, and here we have these two buttons. We're going to click the T-Pose Mesh button. T-Pose Mesh will take each subtool, drop it to its lowest subdivision level, and then merge them together in a temporary posing file. Now this mesh is not going to stick around. We're just going to use this to pose. When we're finished, we'll press T-Pose to sub-T, and that's the button that executes the Transpose Master to copy those positions over to the other subtools. So W for move, control click and drag to mask based on topology down to the waist. Control click to invert the mask, and then control click on the mask itself to feather it. A little bit better. Let's turn on X symmetry again while we're masking. There we go. Control click to invert the mask, and let's paint out some of the mask there on the back, and then control click on the mask itself to feather the edge. Go to rotate, click and drag to draw a new transpose line. Let's position that transpose line down the center of the model. Turn off X symmetry, and then I'm going to click and drag, and that rotates the torso up. Click and drag inside that center circle, and we can do a little bit of rotation on the body down the longitudinal axis of the torso. So let's go ahead and add some more to our mask here. I'm going to paint out the abdomen because I want the rest of this rotation to be centered mainly on the rib cage. Go to R for rotate. Let's click and drag to drag a new transpose line. Move it down the center line of the body. And then just click inside that center circle to get a nice rotation on the torso. Clear the mask. Now, anytime you start posing a character, you really will have to do a fair bit of resculpting because it's going to change the anatomy. It's going to change the underlying shapes. I'm going to turn down the Z intensity on my smooth brush and just do a little bit of shifting of the tummy here. And scooch things around as I go. Take the inflate brush, do a little bit of a compression here. We don't have to get too fancy with our resculpting while we're in Transpose Master, but I do find it helpful to just work into any sort of deformations or tweak things as necessary while I'm posing. Because again, you're going to find as you pose a character, muscles will elongate, fat will compress, the shapes need to change along with the pose. I'm going to go back to Transpose Line. I'm going to hold down the Control key and click and drag down to the arm here. And I just want to mask out everything but this arm. And I'm just going to have to go in here manually and do a little bit of masking. I just want to isolate these shapes. I'm going to come in here and hold down the Control key. Just do a little bit of direct masking. Control click to feather the edge of that mask. Now I'm going to go to the Transpose Line, draw a new Transpose Line from the shoulder out. I'm going to move it so the center of the rotation is sitting about where the rotation of the shoulder would actually be. And then we're going to click and drag to rotate the arm. Go to W for move, or excuse me, go to the move brush, I mean to say, B for brush, M for move, V hotkey. Or use your brush hotkeys that you've set up. If you followed the hotkey video, you should have brush hotkeys already set for the move brush. And I'm just going to smooth that armpit out and then bring that geometry back up in there, just correcting the deformation in that area. And let's do the same thing on the other side. Let's mask down to this arm. Take the Control key and paint the mask up in here. Feather it. Go to Transpose Rotate. Draw a new Transpose Line. And then we can rotate that arm out. Now I want to rotate this arm out around its longitudinal axis. So I'm going to place this Transpose Line going straight sort of down the humerus. Go to Rotate. And remember, pull this outermost circle as far away from the body as possible. Then go to R for rotate, hold the Alt key down, and then click and drag. And you see what that does is that rotates that arm. Let's mask down to the forearm. And we'll do the same thing here. We'll start from the pointy out bit of the elbow, the olecranon process. Drag that out. Go to R for rotate, hold down the Alt key, and then we can pronate and supinate that forearm. Now let's zoom into the hand here. I'm going to go ahead and isolate the hand just by using my visibility marquee. And let's isolate, let's say, the pinky finger. I want to adjust these fingers now so they're not splayed out as if he's pressing them down onto the ground. Now this is very interesting. I could bend this finger by starting my point of rotation here and dragging my Transpose Line up to the tip of the finger and then clicking in the outermost circle. But you see the compression that it makes at the joint there isn't really that good. So what I'll do is I'm going to use something called bone posing, which is available only with the Transpose Line. Go to R for rotate, but I draw my line and leave the last circle at the point of rotation that I want to manipulate. I'm just going to make sure that this is all unmasked. Go back to rotate. Now, if I hold down the Alt key and click in the outermost circle, it has a built-in skinning algorithm, so it stretches what's on the opposite side and compresses what's on the bending side. So let's do that again here at this first knuckle. Hold down the Alt key, click and drag. And you see this is fantastic for posing fingers. We'll do that again. Let's mask down to this ring finger. Manually paint out the mask where necessary. R for rotate. Let's draw our transpose line, ending it at the root of the finger. And I like to move that line so the center of rotation is right there in the center of the joint. Hold down the Alt key and then just bend that finger. And I'll take the move, W for move, and just gently scooch that down a little bit. And then let's do it again. Let's bring the circle here, go to R for rotate, hold down the Alt key, and we'll get a nice bend there. Let's actually bend that finger out a little bit there. Place that circle right there in the center of the joint. Hold down the Alt key and bend. Repeating on the middle finger. R for rotate. Begin by doing the root of the finger here. Go to R for rotate, hold down the Alt key. We'll bend that down. Drag that circle out to the center of the first joint, and then bend that there. Now I'm just going to come in here with my move brush and just scooch these faces at the roots of the fingers back and inflate them a little bit just to make sure that we don't lose volume here in the hand. There we go. And I'm just going to do a slight rotation. I kind of like the posture of these fingers. I just want to make that pointer finger straight out a little bit more than it already is. So let's go ahead and do a manual mask here. Control, click, and drag on the background just to do a masking marquee. R for rotate, and let's draw that transpose line there. Let's position the circle at the center of the rotation. Hold down the Alt key and bend. Bring the last one here, and there we go. Clear our mask, and now you can see we have posed that first hand. Now let's do the same thing for the other hand. I want to supinate this forearm as well. So I'm going to mask down to the forearm, draw my transpose line. Basically, when you're trying to do the forearm, it's best to do the transpose line just straight down the ulna. Right there. Starting at the olecranon process, the elbow, essentially. Bringing that off. Go to R for rotate, hold down the Alt key, and then click and drag. I just want to do a slight rotation to that hand, or that forearm. And now we'll isolate this hand and repeat that process on these fingers. So I'll mask down to this finger. Make sure my center of rotation is at the root of the finger. Go to R for rotate, Alt, click, and drag. That'll bend that finger down. Now we'll do the same thing for the ring finger. Again, you always want to make sure that you've got everything around it masked, because sometimes it can not quite be as opaque as you think it is, that being the mask. So you just want to make sure that you go in there and get those things properly masked out. Let's get that joint and then this joint. And go to the top view, and I just want to straighten that out a bit. Mask down to the middle finger. Once again, just making sure that everything is properly masked. Move that center down inside the center of the finger itself, or the finger joint. Hold down the Alt key and bend. Extend that down to the first finger, or the first knuckle, and bend. Holding down the Alt key as I do. Mask down to the index finger and just manually make sure that we get the rest of the masking in place. Draw a transpose line. Draw a transpose line. Move the transpose line, I mean to say. And let's straighten out that finger. R for rotate. Hold down the Alt key. And hold down the Alt key. And hold down the Alt key. Oops. Let's make sure that we extend our mask to this knuckle. And then hold down the Alt key while we're in rotate. And there we go. And let's do the same for these fingertips here. I'm going to mask this fingertip. Invert that mask. Go to my transpose line. Hold down the Alt key. and rotate. Now I'm going to mask out the pinky finger and the carpal or metacarpal associated with it. I'm going to unmask it by control clicking on the background. I'm going to draw a transpose line here, go to rotate, and I'm going to click inside that center circle, because sometimes you get this nice sort of the pinky finger metacarpal does sort of curve in, so I just want to get that shape there. And then I'm going to rebend that finger. Let's extend the mask. Hold down the Alt key. And I want to get one more bend here at the tip. R for rotate, and let's get that tip. There we go. This fingertip's gone a little funky, so I'm just going to mask it, invert the mask, go to R for rotate, and just click inside that center circle to fix that rotation, and then take the move brush and do any sort of tweaks that need to be done. And there we go. So let's do some posing on the head. So far we've just posed things that require just a single subtool to be manipulated, but we haven't done anything that requires multiple subtools. Let's change the head, including the teeth and the gums. So I'm going to go back to my transpose line. I'm going to transpose mask up to the neck. Now you see that that automatically masks the tongue and the teeth. So I'm going to unmask those by Control Alt, clicking and dragging a marquee around those so they are unmasked. Let's draw a transpose line that runs up the length of the spine, right here. Let's move that transpose line so it's sitting inside the head. And let's move the neck up. So I'm going to rotate by clicking here. Make sure that we're in R for rotate. Rotate that head up. And then click inside the center circle. And we can rotate the neck around its longitude. Now let's mask up to the base of the skull. We're going to have to manually correct any problem areas in the masking here. Manually unmask the teeth and the gum and the tongue. If I Control Shift click on these subtools, I can easily see and isolate them. Let's draw a new transpose line going from the base of the skull forward. Scooch that so it's sitting inside the head. And now, if I click inside the center circle and drag, I can rotate the head around that axis. Or if I click the outermost circle, I can move the head around. So if we're posing for about here, let's do this. Let's make that the pose. There we go. So now I want to see how this looks on the final figure. I'll go to Z plugin, and originally we pressed T-pose mesh. Now I'm going to press T-pose to subtool, and that takes the transpose mesh position and transfers it over to all the individual subtools on our original mesh. So we'll do that now, pressing T-pose to sub-T, and you see each individual subtool snaps into its new position. And I can step back up my subdivision levels in the body, and you can see all of my detail and all of my sculpting follow suit. Let's turn our floor plane back on. There we go. So now we've got a pose on that character that was originally just in a neutral position on all fours. We're able to rear him up and pose him not only the individual fingers and the mesh of the body, but we can also pose subtools together as long as we make sure that they are part of the unmasked group of faces. So transpose essentially will manipulate unmasked groups of faces when you're posing, and just remember that you need to be aware of the type of bend that you want to perform. If I want to bend a finger, I'll use bone posing. That is the Alt, click and drag in the outermost circle. If I want to bend at the waist, for example, I'll do what I did before, which was just a standard, use the transpose rotate line, and I will just click and drag in the outermost circle on rotate, and it will perform exactly as I expect it to. So that's just very important to remember that you do have multiple ways of accomplishing your pose. Transpose has a couple of sort of hidden functions that we just looked at. So just remember that those are there, and you should be just fine. Also remember that you will always need to come back in and do some re-sculpting once you've posed something. So I'll step down my subdivision levels, going with my clay tubes brush, and I'll just try and correct any sort of deformed or strange areas. I'll often smooth from the lower subdivision level and then step back up, and that helps soften out some of the deformations. And I just want to be really aware of how the muscles and bones are interacting and changing shape over the course of this pose, and then follow suit. So here I've got some compression and some problems in the spines here, so I'll just take the inflate brush and sort of inflate those up again. Do the same thing on this side. Take the move brush and just bring my points back into that. Come over here where the leg is compressing against the lateral oblique, and then I'll take my inflate brush. I'm just going to mask out the thigh right here, and I'll just inflate up against it and take the move brush and tuck that down, invert that mask and tuck that against it. And then once I have those two shapes relatively close together, then I'll take the inflate brush and run the inflate brush along that crease like this. That just helps give me a little bit more of a sense of compressing flesh there. And there we go. So now that we've seen how to pose using transpose, I want to point out another option that we have when we're working with Transpose Master, and that is posing with Z-sphere rigs. Now, we briefly talked about Z-sphere rigging in the Z-sphere chapter, but we want to revisit it now because I think it's very, very important to understand that you can use Z-sphere rigs to pose a complex character such as this. So I'm going to initialize ZBrush. There we go. So now we're back to our original mesh. Now I'm going to go to my subtool menu, turn off the floor plane, and we're going to do the exact same thing that we did before by going to Z plugin and Transpose Master, but I'm going to turn on Z Sphere Rig and then press T-Pose Mesh. Now what that is going to do, it's going to automatically set up the model for Z Sphere rigging. So I'm going to go to W for move, turn my draw size down to 0, and I'm going to move that root Z-sphere into the center of the model. Just like so. That's going to be my root Z-sphere. Actually, I want to move it up to about the torso, about the chest here. Then I'm going to go back into draw mode and turn on solo and make sure my X symmetry is turned on. I'm going to draw a child sphere right here. Press Shift to snap it to the same size and double click off the model. And do the same thing here. Draw a child sphere. Double click off the model, turn off solo. I'm going to go to W for move and bring this down to the waist and bring this up to the shoulders. Now if you don't know how to draw Z-spheres yet, go ahead and watch the Z-sphere chapter. You really do need to have seen that to really follow what I'm doing here. Basically we're just drawing a chain of Z-spheres which allow us to create a skeleton. Now typically we use Z-spheres to generate meshes, but we're not doing that here. For the knee, I often, instead of making a single sphere for the knee, I do two spheres, like this. Drag this sphere down. And that's how I structure the knee. And let's draw a child sphere here. W for move and bring that down to the ankle. Draw a child sphere here. And then bring that down into the foot. I'm not worried about posing the toes, so I'm just going to let that sphere carry all the vertices of the toes. Each Z-sphere that we draw is basically going to capture vertices in the rig. So it's going to capture verts and influence verts in the rig. So if I want to move the hips up, I'm going to hold down the Alt key and click in between those two spheres, the root or the hips and the pelvis and the hips, and I can move that as a group. I want to draw a child sphere for the tail, so let's draw a child sphere here, snap it to the same size, and we're just going to move it and scale it down a little bit. Move it. Turn off solo so we can see. Let's bring it to about here. And I'm going to go to Q for draw, and I'm going to add a couple child spheres through here. Let's scale this one down. Scale this one down. Move it inside the tail. Let's scale this one down. Move it inside the tail. And let's draw another child sphere here. Go to W for move, and we'll just bring this up to here. And draw 2 more child spheres along the length of that, and move those into position. And then we'll draw 2 child spheres on either side here. Let's go into solo mode so we can see this better. Draw 2 child spheres here, and then 2 more child spheres on top of that. And then I'll go to move, and I'll bring those little ones out here and scale them down. And then draw a couple child spheres along the length of that and move them inside the prongs of the tail. And make sure that those actually sit correctly from every view. Just like this. Perfect. So now let's come back up here to the torso, go into solo mode, and let's draw some shoulders here. I'm going to go to child spheres, draw 2 shoulders, draw 2 more child spheres, and let's move these out like so. Draw 2 more child spheres here, and let's bring these down to the elbows. Draw a child sphere here, and move that down to the wrist. Now, of course, I could put spheres all the way down inside each finger as well to have total control over the finger posing. Let's get back to that elbow, and let's scale that down. Move that back into the correct position, and like so. Draw a child sphere here, bring that down into the hand. Now we're going to draw our neck spheres. Let's draw a sphere for the neck and a child sphere. Move that child sphere up, move that neck sphere up just a bit, and there we go. Now I'm going to draw a child sphere on the front and on the back. This is to capture the head. Turn off solo, and then I will W for move that forward and that forward. And here we go. So now I'm ready to do my posing. So I'm going to go to rigging and click bind mesh. Now, if I go to R for rotate, turn off my X symmetry, click and drag, you see I'm actually posing the mesh as I work. Now this is best, I think, for doing things like the tail. I can move the tail off center and really curl it as you would sort of as you would expect to see a tail like this manipulated. So if I hold down the Alt key, click in between these two, there we go. There we go. Click and rotate on this sphere here to add a little bit of twist to the tail. Bring that down. Let's put a little bit more here. We can move this leg back. Move this leg forward. There we go. And then if we come down here to the waist, let's solo again so we can actually see our rig. If we click this, there we go, let's click this one here. Let's give that a bit of a rotation. Turn off solo so we can see our mesh again. There we go. So you can see we can actually rotate the entire torso. It's a very, very effective way of posing. There we go. Now once we're happy with it, let's zoom out and just take a good look at it here. So that seems a nice pose. We've actually done quite a bit of manipulation. And you see it's a totally different type of posing than what you might expect to see, say, if you were doing your transpose line, where you're sort of working your way down the limbs, posing bit by bit. This is much more akin to posing with a skeleton in a rigging situation, because it's essentially what's happening. Each one of those Z-spheres is capturing the vertices that are closest to it. So if you do find an area that's not deforming accurately, just go in and add more Z-spheres to that area, and then it'll capture vertices and lock them into the region that you want them to be in. For example, in the torso here, if I'm not getting enough deformation here, I can always add another Z-sphere and maybe extend a couple of ribs, so to speak, coming out, so it will grab these vertices and keep them locked into the shape of the torso as it moves. So now we have rigged this character using our Z-sphere chain. This is where it gets fun. Go to Z plugin and remember where we press T-pose to sub-T. If I press this again, it's going to pick up the pose from my Z-sphere rig and then apply it to my original character. And here we go. It has transposed the pose over. You see we've got that lovely curvature of the tail, positioning of the arms and the limbs. All of that created just with the transpose rig. So hopefully you found this helpful. You can see now how we use the gizmo to move subtools in relation to one another, how we use the transpose line to move objects in relation to one another, and most importantly, how we use the transpose line for posing, and how we use transpose master with Z-sphere rigs to also activate the posing capabilities inside of ZBrush. So hopefully you found this useful, and it's something that you can go forward now and use in your own pipeline. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Now let's take a look at gizmo primitives and deformers. Here I've just got a fresh copy of ZBrush. I'm going to go to my tool palette and select the polymesh star and draw it on the canvas, and then go into edit mode. The polymesh star kind of serves as a null object in ZBrush. It's just sitting at the origin, and it's kind of a placeholder. I'm going to use this to create some primitives. I'll press W to bring up the gizmo. Now, the gizmo we've already talked about in a couple of videos. It basically allows you to move, scale, and rotate subtools independently of one another or as a group. However, it also has an added function here under the gear. Here you see we have the ability to create a variety of different primitives. So I'll begin by selecting a cylinder 3D. Now, here you see it's created a basically generic cylinder, and we've got these cones through here. These cones are modifiers. Here you see there's V divisions, so if I turn that up, I get divisions along V, and here I have divisions along H. So if I turn those up, I can increase the subdivisions. Here I actually have a radius for the center. I can make this a hollow pipe or leave it at 0 and make it a cylinder. Now, if I'm happy with this, I'll just press the W key, and that brings me back into the gizmo. If I go to the gear again, you see I have a variety of different modifiers here. I'm going to scale this along the Z-axis, and then let's open up our modifiers, and let's go to bend curve. Now, all these modifiers function basically the same way. You'll have a bounding box, you'll have dots, which are basically handles for the manipulator, and a variety of cones, which will affect different parameters. So in this case, I have the axis. Currently, it's set to 1, and you see 1 equals the x-axis, 2 equals y, and 3 equals z. So if I turn that up to 3, you see my bend axis is going down the z-axis. Now I can turn on symmetrical. Right now it's set to 0, but I'll turn it up to 1 for yes. And then if we mouse over the white cone here, there is smoothness, and the orange cone is the curve resolution. I'm going to turn this up so I have more dots, more handles along that axis. Now if I click on one of these points here, I can move these points affecting a bend. And each point you see also has modifiers. I've got a scale modifier here. I can turn that up or down. I have a squeeze modifier where I can squeeze this. And then I also have a twist modifier where I can actually twist this endpoint. And I have X symmetry, or excuse me, I have Z symmetry turned on. So you see as I move this point, the other point moves as well. So I can bend this one and then bend this one. I can again twist, scale, or squeeze. Back here, I still have symmetrical. I can turn that on and off.
I still have my axis. I could change my axis if I wanted to, but I probably wouldn't want to at this stage since I've already started making my changes. Then I have smoothness. If I turn smoothness up and down, I can affect the smoothness of the bend. So let's move this over so we can actually see that. Bring this over and adjust the smooth. Increase the resolution along the curve. And smooth. Now, if I'm happy with this, I've got this button here, this curve here, this cone here, smooth. If I turn that up, it'll actually smooth the transition between each one of those points. And then if I click the gear icon, I can accept, reset, full reset, or delete. I'm going to accept, and that accepts that deformation. I have now actually baked that deformation down into that object. I can add a subdivision level if I like to smooth it down further. And there we go. Now, whenever I'm working with the gizmo, if I hold down Control, Shift, click and drag, actually I need to step down a subdivision level and delete my higher. This only works if you have one subdivision level. While I'm in the gizmo, if I Control, Shift, click and drag, it will duplicate this object. Now, it's not duplicating it and making it a separate subtool. It's still within the same subtool. It's just a duplicate. So I basically have these two meshes together in one subtool. So let's do another one now. I will duplicate this subtool, go to my gizmo, and now let's create a polycube. There we go. And go to the gizmo here, and let's reset it so we snap it back to its original position. Put it at the home point, and let's bring it up here. Turn off visibility on our previous one. Now, I will go to the polycube options, and this allows me to change the parameters of the polycube. I can increase the resolution in each axis here. And then I can go back to my deformers. Another very interesting deformer is project primitive. Project primitive will project a primitive shape into another primitive. So here the gizmo is affecting the primitive itself. So if I bring this up, you can see it's a sphere that's being projected. Now if I bring it just outside of the square, it becomes a recess. If I bring it back down, it becomes a sphere. Now these white dots allow me to shear the effect of that primitive, so I can slice parts of that off. Of course, I can scale it, rotate it, do whatever with this gizmo. Now, here we have another set of cones. We have blend, so if I turn blend up, I can change the way it blends into the underlying mesh. I can turn on new surface, which creates a new surface from this, and I have accept. So these will basically bake the effect, so I don't quite want to do these just yet. Over here, we have another set. This is T symmetry, or excuse me, Y symmetry, radial symmetry, and X symmetry. So if I turn radial symmetry on and move this off, let's turn on that radial symmetry again. There we go. We have to turn on another axis, and we'll scale this down, bring it down, and then move it out. And you see we have a radial symmetry here. If I turn down my radial symmetry count, there we go. You see we actually get a series of these projected primitives. Now over here, I have Y opacity. I can turn up and down the Y opacity, which effectively sort of clips the effect. Z opacity and X opacity. I have tessellate, which will affect the tessellation of the mesh. So if I turn this up or down, it affects just how dense that projected primitive is, and thus how smooth it is. Maximum displacement. Now I can adjust this, again, to sort of clip that effect. I can turn the volume essentially up and down on that projection. Opacity is another kind of volume control. You see it's basically limiting the impact of that projection. And then apply changes. So if I click this, it will apply that, and now that has actually been applied to the mesh. So let's come over here. We have accept. We've just accepted that change. So I clicked and dragged the accept. That accepts that change, and now I can move my projected primitive, and the previous projected primitive is still there, but I can change this projected primitive. If I'm happy with that, I'll accept it, and then I will move this one in. And let's change our radial symmetry count.
Make that smaller. Move that in. And let's turn that up. So those are going inside rather than out. There we go. And now let's adjust our primitive type. Here we have primitive axis, primitive type, and the last cone here is modifier. So if I adjust the modifier, I can change the shape. If I turn that down, I basically make them more square. And if I adjust my primitive type here, I can change from sphere, triangle, cube. There's a variety of different primitives that I can choose from here. If I turn it up to here and then move it up, down, let's get that back. There we are. So we get an entirely different type of shape here. And then when I'm happy with that, I just click accept, and that now accepts that. So if I'm happy with this, I click the gizmo and click accept, and now that has been baked into that geometry. Here you see that this is actually part of that polymesh. Now, project primitive is very, very useful. I like using this to create greebles or little mechanical details on things, little repeating forms, just things that help give an object more of a sense of complexity and use, especially if you're trying to do like a spaceship or a piece of mech or tech. It's nice to have these sort of repeating mechanical forms because it just adds a sense of veracity or realism to the object. I'm going to append a polymesh star in and select that one. Go back to my gizmo and let's change to a different primitive now. Let's go to a polycube once again. Go to our modifiers, and bend arc and bend curve are essentially the same. Bend uses an arc and curve uses a curve. Bevel is quite nice. So if we go to bevel, you see what we're getting here is actually a bevel on all of our edges. I can adjust the size of the bevel with this slider here. I can adjust the resolution of it, and I can adjust the crease angle. So this is actually very nice. Again, whenever you're creating mech or hard surface pieces, it's always nice to avoid having a perfectly 90-degree edge. It's good to add a bevel to those edges so it catches light in a more realistic way. Now, as we move through here, we have various other deformers which are quite nice. There is the deformer, and the deformer is basically like a lattice. If I click these points, I can freeform distort the mesh, creating some very, very interesting effects. Once again, we have the series of cones here, which are controllers. We have the divisions along X, the divisions along Y and Z. Here we have, let's move over here so we can actually see that. Here we have the smoothness. So if I turn up the smoothness or turn down the smoothness, it will impact the smoothness of that transition. And we have symmetry as well. So we can do parallel symmetry or mirror symmetry. So if I turn on symmetry and then grab these points again. There you go. You see that actually mirrors that lattice symmetrically. And as always, if I'm happy with the piece and I want to keep it, I just press the gear and click accept, or I can click reset, and that will reset those settings and allow me to go back and change them. Going back to the gear, we can access the rest of our deformers here. Flatten is a particularly nice one. Flatten, you use these cones to actually flatten portions of the mesh. So let's change this primitive now to a polysphere. Let's turn up our resolution. And then let's go to flatten. And now if I use these cones, I can slice off portions. And then go to our cones here, and I can adjust my symmetry. So if I want symmetry, I can turn that on along each axis. So if I turn it on the x-axis, I am mirroring across the x-axis, and along the z-axis, I am mirroring along the z-axis, like so. So then if I make further changes, it will continue to mirror. Accept, and then we are done. Now, we have various others. We have already seen project primitive. We can come down here to taper. Taper is a particularly nice one. Basically, it utilizes the same technique with these orange curves. I can taper down various angles of the mesh here. So if I want to mirror that, that's our opacity, excuse me. Here we go. There's our exponent. If I turn my exponent up and down, I can adjust the fall off of that taper. There's my opacity X, Y, and Z. And there we go. We can reset that now. We get back to our original shape. Twist is another very nice one. Twist will twist along the axis that you actually select. So I can take this and twist it, which is a great way to create something like, for example, a drill bit or a spiral staircase or any type of twisted organic form. I quite like this modifier and use it a lot to create sort of interesting shapes. I can actually negative twist that one. On the positive twist on that, we get a very, very neat kind of shape here. Hit the gizmo gear and click accept, and that is now baked down as part of the geometry. Now we also have the extender. The extender actually works best if we go back to a cube. It'll be a lot more clear if you see this with a cube. If I go to my deformers and I select extender, the extender, if I take the orange circle here, I can actually expand essentially this shape. So I'm extending it along this axis, and here I've got the X size. I can change the size after my extension. Here, you see, I've got the size and the extender for each axis. And then down here, I have resolution. So if I turn up my resolution, I can increase the resolution of that transitional area. So again, this is really nice for going in and creating interesting extrusions and complex forms. I also have an inflate slider here where I can inflate that effectively. If I wanted to create like a banding around an object, I can do that using the extender with inflate. If I'm happy with that, let's accept it. And then we can go back to our deformers and go to bevel. And then we can bevel those shapes, giving us a nice sort of transitional bevel on each edge, and accept that. Now there's a variety of other deformers in here, and they all essentially follow the same general idea. You're always going to have a series of cones that will affect all of the various parameters for your effect. So here I'm on multi-slice. So you see I've got apply creasing. It's set to 0. We'll leave it at that. Here I've got my center. I'll leave the center point as it is. And we've got X resolution, Y resolution, and Z resolution. And then the colored cones here, we have slice width. We have slice, there you go. We have slice width in each axis. Like so, and then we grab this. Let's go to frame mode so we can actually see what we're doing here. There we go. There's our slice. And let's turn our resolution up, or width up, I mean. There we go. Let's turn our resolution down. And there you are. So we're basically creating a slice through the mesh, and you notice each plane gets its own polygroup. I can do another one in a different axis here. There we go. If I want to move that center point, I can do that, and I can move that slice along the length of the object. Turn my resolution down. Turn my width up. When I'm happy with that, click the gear and accept those changes. So these deformers are a great way to go in and create interesting new forms, especially if you're trying to create greebles, which are just little hard surface detail pieces, insert mesh brushes. If you watch the Boolean chapter, we're going to use these deformers to create a knife. We're going to use taper and scale and create a knife blade, and then use booleans and primitives to actually create a complex sort of hunting knife. So it's a very powerful tool that's actually nested down inside the interface. It works really nicely as well with the Z modeler tools because it does polygroup as you go. So for example, if I go to B for brush, Z for Z modeler, and select my Z modeler brush, I'm going to click OK on dynamic draw size. Now, if you have not seen the video on ZModeler yet, go ahead and take a look at that. But just as a quick example, if I press the space bar here, I'm going to use QMesh as my modeling tool. My target, I'm going to do polygroup island, and then we'll leave the modifiers as they are. So what will happen here is if I click and drag, oops. Let's zoom in here so we actually can grab a face. If I click and drag on one of these faces, it's going to extrude everything from that particular polygroup.
So it's actually really nice that it does this polygrouping. It makes life, quite a bit easier and helps you create even more interesting variations on what you've been working on, simply because it's been organizing your mesh as you go. So polygroups, again, are very, very helpful, indispensable, I would say, especially when you're getting into, ZModeler and hard surface. They're going to come into play and be very, very important. So I press the W key again. That brings back my gizmo. Press the gear, and then I can see my primitives and my deformers once again. So hopefully you found this helpful. Go ahead and give an exploration of all these different deformers, and you see that essentially they behave very consistently. You're going to have a series of cones to change your parameters, and when you're happy with your work, simply return to the gizmo gear icon and click Accept to bake those changes down. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Again, for more information on deformers and seeing them used in action, watch the Boolean tutorial where we use them extensively to create a knife blade. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.